Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your attendance this evening on a most auspicious occasion. My name is Gary Van Dolzer, and this particular evening I am portraying George Washington, something I do on a regular basis, and we will conduct it from the point of view that you have a little traveler in your midst that has come in from a very long distance and is somewhat tired from having done so. My horse Nelson does not tolerate this kind of travel very well. We'll begin with an opening prayer, and Miss Marino, of all the responsibilities we should assume in a meeting such as this, the first one is to give honor to the banner of liberty. And so we have asked and requested and received the volunteer services of Mr. Todd Grant to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Grant, would you please come forward?
Please stand and join with me in repeating the Pledge of Allegiance.
Then let us begin, as we are somewhat behind our time. Let me reiterate that you are gathered today, this evening, on a most auspicious occasion, which is the celebration of one of the greatest and most unique documents that have ever been formulated by the mind of man with the wisdom of providence assisting. And that is the Bill of Rights, a series of addenda to the Constitution, which was a document formulated and stands next to Scripture in importance to this people and indeed to all the world. This is a most auspicious occasion also, because you are embarking soon upon, indeed are embarked upon, waters which bring you to the exercise of your franchise, wherein you will have the opportunity to choose those individuals who will travel to the federal city and represent you in your government and administer the affairs of this government. It is a sacred and a holy duty that has not been accorded to any other people in history, and great sacrifices were made to assure that you would have this privilege. I and all of my friends who have passed beyond would urge you to exercise that franchise both diligently and intelligently. The sacrifices that were given to hold for you that privilege have been great indeed. There are over 2 million graves of American patriots around the world that have sealed in blood the liberty you enjoy. Do not disappoint those souls who have gone beyond, but use that franchise wisely and carry forward for yourself and for your children the same privileges they vouchsafe to you. This nation has been through many crises of war, crises of pestilence, crises of many, many different types, and in each case the spirit of the people carried the nation forward into new destinies and new greatness. 3 times we have faced great crises that could have submerged the freedom we enjoy today. 2 of those were overcome. And in each case, they were overcome with the assistance of valiant families, the Jeffersons, the Adamses, the Henrys, and many others who stood by their country and pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor that which they were gaining for you would continue forward. They sealed their testimony with their blood and their sweat and their toil. Today you face the greatest of all the crises, as I witnessed in Valley Forge in vision, a crisis of the spirit of the American people, when all that was gained might well be submerged and lost to history. And should that happen, the name of American will be held in ignominy through all time. But we can proceed forward, seal the blessings of providence upon this people again, and bring forward the heritage of liberty that we enjoy to our children. My friend Mr. Jefferson noted that the tree of liberty must be watered betimes with the blood of patriots and of tyrants. And I urge you to consider that it not be sealed and watered with the blood of your children, but rather with the tears of our contrition And the greatest weapons we have are those of education. In this latter time in this nation, there are other families that have stood by this nation giving information. The strongest weapon that we have, knowledge and wisdom, given from on high through the organs that are left here upon the earth as their instruments. One of these would be the Skousen family, whom we have on the other side observed well. They have ever stood by this country and ever spoken the truth, though sometimes the truth be hard to those who do not find it amenable. You have the privilege now to hear from one of the sons of that great family, Joel Skousen, the editor of the World Affairs Brief, and a resume much too long for me to repeat for you here. It would be ill of me, who have passed beyond over 200 years ago, to take the time from him. So, Mr. Skousen, will you step forward, please, and introduce your own self to this august body?
It's a pleasure to be with you, and bringing the greetings of Ron Paul, who is aware of your faithfulness in fighting for a cause. Here's a letter that he sent out to all of us on his mailing list today, and I thought I would read it to you. It's my introduction. He says, "What an amazing mission you and I are on. What great ideals and ideas we uphold. The legacy of the most important thinkers of liberty in our country's history, and the most important doers of liberty in America. At the top of that list are the donors and volunteers to my campaign. I could spend all my time thanking personally you and everyone who's done so much for our country's future and not scratch the surface of what justice demands. But I want you to know how much I owe you, everyone dedicated to the real America. You and I know our real country, the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights, of economic, civil, and personal liberty, of strong families and communities, of great businesses and professions, of strong peace and low taxes and sound money, all of which are under assault by the politicians who occupy our nation's capital. With your help, and I can't do anything without your help, I want to change all that. Together we can restore our constitutional republic and oust the mountebanks who violate the ideals of the founders with income taxes, Federal Reserve inflation, deficit spending, preemptive wars, torture, secret prisons, abolition of habeas corpus. And how thrilling, too, are all the great independent efforts in this cause, involving so many tens and thousands of patriots. And, of course, since they are independent, the election laws do not allow me to coordinate with them in any way. But I will mention that this Sunday I'm going to really enjoy my tea at a party. I want to encourage you all to donate as I have, intend to donate again on Sunday. This is very important. I heard a PBS interview on Ron Paul. I gave him nearly an hour of special coverage on Wednesday. And they interviewed Trevor Lyman, who independently, as an internet guru, has raised over $4 million for Ron Paul. This to the establishment is absolutely phenomenal. Every one of the other candidates either have hardly any financing because they aren't on the big list. What's the big list? It's the big list of major corporations that spread the money both between Republicans and Democrats who are approved by the establishment. You'll notice the campaign contributions to Senator Orrin Hatch, presumably a conservative, but they include gambling casinos from Las Vegas. What are they giving to a Mormon politician who's supposedly conservative and against gambling? What's in it for them? What's in it for, well, I could name half of it, but they're all major international corporations, none of which are in Utah. And they're all contributing yearly, regularly, to Senator Hatch's campaign. Why did they do that? Because he's on the approved list. It doesn't mean he's a knowing conspirator with those that conspire to take away liberty. But he's predictable, and he's manipulable under a variety of circumstances. And Trevor Lyman said in his interview when PBS asked him, well, you know, it's very unlikely, as we've heard from various people we've interviewed for this show, that you're not going to win the presidency. What's going to happen to the movement, after Ron Paul, loses? And Trevor Lyman says, well, this movement is bigger than Ron Paul. It's not going to die because of Ron Paul. And I'm going to make a little bit of a challenge to that. These principles that we're going to talk about tonight of sustaining the Constitution and the Bill of Rights have been around for a long time, and they've gone nowhere. We haven't been able to build a movement since Barry Goldwater that comes close to what Ron Paul is being able to do. And why is that? The man is important, I assert to you. And the reason Ron Paul is important to this movement, the reason this movement has grown and tripled again in the past year is because of Ron Paul, not the principles. Now, why do I say that? I'm a person of principle. I've studied it. I dedicated my life to the principles. But principles don't sell. I'd be afraid that you're going to be bored tonight because I'm going to talk about law. Law that you need to understand and the principles of law that will help you dissect the very flawed and misconstrued principles underlying local politicians like Governor Huntsman or Mitt Romney, who promote a mandatory health insurance. There's nothing more evil than something that mandates that government tell you what is good for you. It's a gross violation of the basic principles of life, because it represents what I call an unlimited extension of lawmaking power. If you can start to mandate what government, a set of bureaucrats, thinks is beneficial for, is there any limit to that? No, the only limit is what it's going to cost or what the people will finally rebel at. But there's no limit in principle to what they can mandate in the name of what's good. And we'll discuss that a little bit closer. But as Paul the Apostle said in the Scriptures, certain men give an uncertain sound to their trumpet. And when you listen to Mitt Romney waffle about torture, I'm not going to tell you whether waterboarding is torture. I'm not going to get into that, whether or not this is torture. I mean, here's a person who had an opportunity to stand up and champion, of course it's torture. Of course it's torture. And I won't allow it as president. Can you imagine the feeling you would get if you saw a person like that take that kind of stand? Well, that's the kind of man that Ron Paul is. And that's why he makes a difference. There were at least 3 or 4 people who were converted Democrats coming over to Ron Paul because they said, I can't trust any politician anymore. None of them. But when Ron Paul speaks, I feel he's telling the absolute truth, that he's uncorruptible, and that no one's going to change his mind. And that's precisely why this set of powers that be are scared to death that Ron Paul is going to win this nomination. Now, that's a long, long shot. I've been in the conservative movement for many, many years, since I was chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C. And I did some hard numbers. There's a lot of people who claim that they're conservative, a lot of people that claim that they're religious Christian conservatives. But when you put out surveys like I did as part of Richard Vigory's organization, and when I was serving at his behest as chairman or as editor of Conservative Digest, we did extensive surveying of the conservative movement of whether or not, and this was during the Reagan administration, which supposedly was the most conservative administration we've had for decades, and yet there were severe compromises of our liberty going on under the Reagan administration because he, as part of his deal with the media, had to accept control over his administration, give it to George Bush and the CFR people that staffed his organization. There was also a cadre of homosexuals within his administration. A lot of serious compromises going on, and we were trying to stop that, and we put out several surveys to conservatives saying, would you agree that we'll draw a line in the sand? We will not accept these types of compromises of the conservative principles. And literally less than 5% of conservatives, ladies and gentlemen, would go along with a hardline stand. That was clear back in the 80s. Now, we've actually had a resurgence because of George Bush being in the office of true conservatives. They have really been soured on this man pretending to be a conservative Christian. But the majority of traditional conservatives, especially in the state of Utah, are completely snookered, taken in, deceived by George Bush. George Bush is that very interesting kind of person that can believe that he is both a Christian and a member of Skull and Bones and not see any contradiction between the two things. Now, Ron Paul isn't that kind of man. Ron Paul can see the nuances. He's very, very brilliant, in fact, as well as down to earth. So on this day that we celebrate the Bill of Rights, we also need to celebrate that we have a champion. And that's why this is one of the last times we may have to really find out how much support we've got in this country for a principled approach to law. And because we have a champion who, though not charismatic, gives people who are sensitive to conscience, sensitive to truth, a feeling in their heart. This man is telling the truth. And we haven't had that for generations in this country. In fact, the greatest weaknesses, the greatest moral weaknesses of this nation is that we no longer have people sufficiently schooled in listening to the Spirit of the Lord that they can detect wolves in sheep's clothing. They cannot detect it. If they say they're Christian, if they invite them to the White House, if they talk about prayer, even Bill Clinton talked about prayer, which was utter blasphemy. But if they say those words, fundamentalist Christians believe, Mormon Christians believe, and it's because they have ceased to listen to the Spirit of the Lord. And that's the truth, as hard as it may sound. That doesn't mean they don't hear the Spirit of the Lord in all things. For indeed, people learn to be selective about what they listen to. So I appeal to you and encourage you highly to support this man, Ron Paul. He's not got the age in him to run again. Our biggest battle is going to be to convince Ron to run as an independent after he loses the nomination, because he does have sufficient power to determine who wins. He doesn't have the power to win. I don't think we've got the numbers. But he has the power to determine who becomes president. He can deny a Republican the presidency if he'll run against the Republicans. And believe me, that Republican will be a globalist. He may not be a knowing one. We've got Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas. And Mike Huckabee is being groomed, the big surge that the news is talking about. Why didn't they talk about that surge relative to Ron Paul when he raised $4 million in a day? They never mentioned the word surge. They never talked about him surging in the polls. And that's why he doesn't surge in the polls, because people sit there and listen to their televisions and they believe who's surging and they get on the bandwagon. But Mike Huckabee is going to be the Jimmy Carter of the Republican Party if they can't elect Giuliani. Now, Giuliani is the globalist, who, in my opinion, is a knowing conspirator with the same people that took down 9/11. He knew about it. He covered up for it. I'll be straightforward. This man is as evil as they come. And they want him to be president. He will be the new FDR who will take this nation into World War III, the greatest of all terrorist attacks upon this nation, when Russia and China will run a preemptive nuclear strike on this nation. And our own government is setting us up for it. That's why they're out antagonizing the world in the Middle East, to make us hated, to make us the bully of the world, to hand on a silver platter an excuse to Russia and China to someday take down the bully of the world. Now, we're going to suffer the consequences for these globes, but they will come out of their bunkers, which they're building, and they will say the Russians deceived us. We didn't know. Baloney, they don't know. If I know what the Russians are doing, certainly they know. If I know what the Chinese are doing, certainly they know. They're lying to us. They will claim innocence. They will say that intelligence was faulty again, just like in 9/11. They have every excuse in the world. But because we'll have been attacked, they will say, in the name of God, country, and the Constitution, we must fight another glorious world war just like World War II. And you'll see bumper stickers and little support our troops things on everybody's car, and they'll go marching on to the globalist New World Order, totally ignorant that this is another war devised to give them an excuse to have us cry out for deliverance. And since our own military will be destroyed, we'll cry out for deliverance to the United Nations to save us. Of course, they're steering us to the United Nations as who we need to look for as we rebuild our military purpose. Now, that's what we're in store for. Ron Paul will stop that. He will not allow that to happen. Now, I frankly believe that if he ever got the nomination, if he ever became president, he wouldn't live very long. This is a secret combination we're dealing with, and they are deadly. They have killed presidents before. They have killed corrupt civil rights leaders before to make martyrs out of them, to boost their cause. And they're capable of taking down good people as well. So why should we get behind Ron Paul? Because believe me, our purpose, and God will hold us responsible for this, our purpose is to build a remnant who will resist when this tyranny takes place. The only phrase I do not repeat in the Pledge of Allegiance is the phrase that was added called indivisible. If we are indivisible by force, then we're no better than the Soviet Union. I believe, rather, in the Declaration of Independence, that when tyranny raises its head, it is the right and the power of those who hold the actual rights of government to withdraw their support from that government. And I testify to you that someday you will not be able to support this government. You can hardly do so now, even though they still say the right things. Even Bill Clinton pays homage to the Constitution. Even George Bush pays homage to the Constitution. So that's easy. But Ron Paul pays true homage to the Constitution because he lives by it, and that's why he's called Dr. No. He votes no against most everything in Congress. And that's the way that it should be. Now I'm going to begin my introduction tonight to this celebration of the Bill of Rights by asking the question, why hasn't our Constitution been sufficient to protect us and our rights? Now you think and you pray, and I hear it every Sunday, especially around the 4th of July. We thank God for living in this free land. But I tell you, we've got less than half of our freedoms left. But as long as they let religious people worship as they think they might, they think they're free, even though they're being taxed to death, even though they're being regulated to death, even though they no longer have the right of habeas corpus. Do you realize that it's gone? Just because they haven't thrown you in jail doesn't mean it's gone. It's gone. On 2 court rulings. One ruling by Marcia Clark, I believe, one of the district judges in the District of Columbia, who ruled that Jose Padilla's internment for 3 years without charges was constitutionally sound. If not 3 years, why not 5 years? Why not 10 years? And what was the basis of that ruling? The basis was that, well, normally it takes the Justice Department a few weeks to develop the charges to bring them before a judge for the initial hearing. So if 2 weeks are all right, then why not 3 years? And if why not 3 years, why not 5 years? What you're talking about now, Miss Judge, is indefinite detention. You're talking about the demise of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means in Latin, bring forth the body. And when you have the power to put somebody in jail, when someday I disappear from the streets and people wonder where I am, somebody's got the right, and it doesn't have to be me. The person who's in prison can't ask for a writ of habeas corpus, especially if he's in solitary confinement. But his neighbors can petition a writ of habeas corpus. Lawyers can do it. A brother, a mother, a family, a wife can petition the court for a writ of habeas corpus. Bring forth the body and show cause. Government, show cause why you have held him. And this whole baloney that she said, as long as they don't charge him, the speedy trial statute does not start to take effect. As long as they don't charge him with a crime, There is no need for a speedy trial. Now, that's how they're starting to get around the Bill of Rights. Now, the Constitution was a wonderful, great leap forward in limiting government power. And what did it do? It limited everything except what? What was itemized in this document. That was the brilliant thing about the Constitution. No other Constitution does that in this world. Not one. They may give powers and they may say these are a few limitations which are so very generally worded that they can get around. But no Constitution before or since has ever said government is limited and cannot do anything except what is specified. Specified powers is the most powerful aspect of our Constitution. And it was the first to go through court interpretation. Do you understand that? It was the very first to go. And why was it? Immediately they said, oh, we need a national bank. At least the monetary powers did. There was no specified powers for a national bank. And that was the first major controversy of the Constitution during George Washington. He was a very weak president during that. Excuse me, George. But you know that now, after 200 years being up in heaven and seeing how these things work, there were conspiring people around you trying to stretch this Constitution and make it fit what they wanted to do. The Constitution provided a mechanism to slow down the inexorable march of majoritarian power and corruption. Now notice I didn't say tyranny. I said the inexorable march of majoritarian power. Majorities can be just as tyrannical as tyrants. And so can law. And that's why we owe no allegiance to law just because it's the law of the land. We only owe allegiance to law, and the Lord permits that. And allegiance to the law when it does what? When it abides by the principles of liberty which I have established on this earth. So, our allegiance to law is conditional, is it not? It is conditional. There is no absolute allegiance to law, either in the Pauline letters in the Old Testament or the justification in LDS doctrine, in the Doctrine and Covenants. It is conditional, if you read all of the scriptures concerning it. As a matter of historical fact, the Constitution was under assault to expand the powers of government from the moment it became the law of the land. In its present interpreted and amended form, the Constitution is much changed from the original, some things for the better and many things for the worse. Now, conservatives will often fall back on what they consider the ultimate authority, the Founding Fathers. Now, I'm not here to dispute that, except for one thing. Which founders? Which ones? You include Hamilton as the founders? Well, most of you do. Hamilton wrote the majority of the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution. But you know why he did it? He was a monarchist. He didn't like the Constitution, but he saw it as a stepping stone. And so he connived to get it in power because he knew it could be interpreted away in favor of more power to the federal government that he wanted when he started out. Now, that's the type of people we have. So I don't consider him one of the founders in the spirit of Madison. In fact, most of the greatest of the founders were, in fact, the anti-federalists, the ones who voted against the Constitution. And why did they vote against it? They correctly perceived that it was full of holes that big you could drive a truck through. And that it would be, and that people would drive a truck through it. And they have driven trucks and trains and ships through it. Now, that is not to say that the principles weren't great. What I'm here to tell you is that the founders got all that they could get. And they couldn't get any more. They barely got what they got. And it was miraculous what they did. And I want to explain to you in principle so that you understand where the strengths and the weaknesses are. And the Bill of Rights happens to be one of the portions of the Constitution, which is its greatest strength because of what? Because of its specificity. It specifically says, thou shalt not. Very difficult to overcome, is it not? And the rest of the Constitution is general things, the general welfare clause. Great, that means socialism, doesn't it? No. General welfare meant the laws and rules of common law as supporting fundamental rights. That is what the welfare of all is, the defending of individual rights. That's what they meant. Everybody knew that's what they meant. And they let that drift for 20 or 30 years. It took them 78, almost 100 years before people had forgotten enough and they could start to interpret the General Welfare Clause as welfare, meaning benefits given to other people. So, as I said about the Founding Fathers, we usually, because most conservatives do not and aren't trained in the law, and believe me, the training I'm going to give you here today, you don't get in law school. I'm a trained political scientist, and I didn't get it in political science, even at Brigham Young University. I got socialism there. I had to reject everything I learned at Brigham Young University. It was disgusting. And it's even a little better now, believe it or not, because they've got a few token conservatives there. They have 2 token professors at the law school at BYU, and they never listened to them. Richard Wilkins is one of them, a true defender of the Constitution, but he's not considered one of the in-boys there. And that's how that university treats real constitutionalism, with tokenism. But conservatives often fall back on, well, the Constitution according to the founders. But there never really was a unified voice of the founders. What we call original intent is a combination of the best ideas from both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, by the way, like George Mason. And George Mason really, even though James Madison penned the original 12 Bill of Rights or amendments to the Constitution that were going to be presented and talked about here today, it was George Mason that he took them from. He's the real founder of liberty and the ideas. If you ever really want to learn about liberty, you read the writings of George Mason. They had widely heated differences of opinion during the Convention of 1787 and afterwards. Taken as a whole, what the founders accomplished was a miracle considering the extreme factions that you have to deal with in the Constitutional Convention. But that miracle of sage compromises did not mean the Constitution was perfect or even came close to creating a solid barrier against government encroachments on liberty, especially at the state and local level. How many of you realize that the original Bill of Rights was not applicable to the states? The states could violate anybody's rights. States weren't required to abide by any of the rights, not until the 14th Amendment, and actually several years after when the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied to the states. And do you know why the Constitution was undermined so successfully? Because it was the state governments that were busy violating rights. After the Constitution passed, we had state governments creating state churches and paying ministers. We had them creating state monopolies. We had them in Missouri signing orders to exterminate Mormons, which was still on the books till 1976 to the embarrassment of the state. These were gross violations of fundamental rights, but there was no restriction against states doing anything. And why did they accept that? Why did the founders who believed in liberty so much accept that? Because of slavery. It was a major compromise. These Bill of Rights would have prohibited slavery. And the slave states knew that. So they couldn't accept. In other words, you throw out all the Bill of Rights, or you exempt us, the states, from those Bill of Rights. And they chose a compromise to exempt the states. And so once the states were exempt, they continued slavery. They continued those other violations. You had all the kinds of collusion. Anytime you have government, you have men with money trying to gain collusion with those people to gain access to government contracts and powers and that kind of corruption. The railroads were coming along. Industry was coming. When war comes along, the state gets involved in so much collusion with big business. They need big business to get things done, and big business asks for special favors, and they get this, and they give and contribute to their campaigns. And so you have this interlocking relationship. It's very, very natural to happen. It's corrupt. People of conscience don't do that, but there are very few people of conscience. And so do you see what that one compromise did? They couldn't have got any constitution without it. And so they gave up that in order to at least restrict the federal government to this Bill of Rights. And it has done its job about 70% of the way. When I go through the Bill of Rights, I'll show you which points have really been severely compromised. And you'll see it's because the language was not good enough. The language was too general. That's the danger. They were afraid if they made it too specific, they might miss something. So they made it general, knowing that everybody else was lawyers and principled people, and they knew that they wouldn't take advantage of it. But that didn't speak for people later on. The founders who prevailed at the convention got done what they could during a time of grave weakness and instability in government, and it was a wonderful beginning. No other time, before or since, and this is an important point, has the Lord allowed a small group of principled people to rise to the pinnacle of power. We have one lone man in all of Congress, and that's Ron Paul. One lone man. Now you say, what about Tom Tancredo and Duncan Hunter? They've made some severe compromises. They're generally about 70 or 80% in the right ball, but only Ron Paul is the only statesman we have. He deserves our undying support. He has been faithful to the very end there. But there are many gaping holes in this document which would be used in the ensuing years by statists to continually expand the power of government. These are the issues that we must address today. It's not enough, I assert to you, that we sit around and honor only the Constitution, because the Constitution won't get you back to where we need to get. And I'm going to surprise you with that. Why will the Constitution not restore the full range of liberty? Precisely because of two things. First of all, which version do you choose to restore your liberty under? Which version? Do you want the version with no Bill of Rights? Or do we accept the second version with the first 12 amendments, two of which were removed? One of those two was to make the Bill of Rights applicable to the states. They got rid of that. We have 10 left. So that's a partial Bill of Rights. By the way, this is not a bill of fundamental rights. This is only a bill of the common procedural civil rights from the common law. These are procedural, legal, and criminal and civil. In a civil procedure, when it's citizen against government, it's a very limited portion of the overall fundamental rights, which are found nowhere in the Constitution. And because they're not there, and because the founders did not have a working definition of how to define fundamental rights, we now have a bevy of false fundamental rights dictated by the courts. A right to an abortion, a right to health care, a right to education. These have become sacrosanct, but they're false rights, and I'll explain to you why they're false. Keep in mind that the second version of the Bill of Rights, as I said before, had exempted the states. Now, for the next 100 years, the states were the prime violators of fundamental rights, which engendered a huge public demand for expanded federal powers to control the predation of the states. So do we accept the 1868 version with the 14th Amendment, including the incorporation doctrine? The incorporation doctrine is the legal doctrine that strains the interpretation of this amendment and brings the states under the requirement of the Bill of Rights, but it only does it selectively. You will notice that the Supreme Court has never said the Second Amendment applies to the states. Well, they interpret out a right of privacy or Miranda rights, bind the states with those. But the Second Amendment, they still allow the states and city governments to ban handguns, as they did in Washington, D.C., haven't they? Under the incorporation doctrine, they should put all of the Bill of Rights and apply them to the states, which means the states cannot regulate or deny people a right to bear arms, but they have never applied that. Do you see how they use interpretation selectively, just where they want to? In fact, I'll show you that they only defend the Bill of Rights selectively. They do not defend the ones that they don't want to. So while this did curtail the 14th Amendment much state mischief, it also allowed the courts to add new rights, because remember, rights weren't defined in the Constitution, but now by saying that we have established fundamental rights in the 14th because of slavery, it gave the court the ability to define, and they never, not define rights, but to name rights, that these are rights that we think exist. And thus much mischief has come about because of that. So we now have right to an abortion, right to public access without discrimination, and that's a very severe violation, by the way, of one of your fundamental rights. One of your greatest fundamental rights is your right to discriminate. Now, much as you may eschew racial discrimination, Do you realize the right to discriminate is the right to say, I don't want to do business with you. I don't want to rent my house to you. I don't want to associate with you. You've lost that right with the Civil Rights Bill. You've lost that right with the Americans for Disability Act. You don't have the right. And now they're adding homosexuals to it, and they're adding a whole bunch of other people. Pretty soon it's going to be, well, I won't go into what they're capable of doing. But believe me, if you lose the right to disassociate, it threatens your religious rights someday. Doesn't it not? It's no longer allowed to restrict your religious association, and it can be used eventually to not be able to restrict women in the priesthood. You watch where they can go with this. It's very, very dangerous. It's what I call allowing unlimited extensions of lawmaking power. And you look at this and say, oh, this is about racial discrimination. None of us would like to racially discriminate. But I defend the right of people to make class judgments, even racial ones. Because there are certain circumstances when class judgments are very necessary. Because you don't have the time to interview every individual and make sure they're safe. So when you see, for example, people that look like gangs and act like gangs and have the earrings and the tattoos and the other things, you make a class judgment. The human mind automatically does that. You know, we pretend sometimes that we never make class judgments because it's been so denigrated in our public education, in the media. But you make them. And you make them for your own self-defense, so that you don't get stuck in the middle of a neighborhood where it's full of gang members. Your mind tells you this is bad. These people are not trustworthy, and you need to get out of there. You need to disassociate yourself. You need to discriminate based on a class. Now, when does class judgment become evil? It only becomes evil when you stop looking at the details, when you have the time to look at the details. In other words, you make class judgments to protect yourself when you see that there's certain problems that are associated with certain classes. But when you have the time and you're interviewing and you have a person who says, I'm an exception to the class, you listen to him. And as long as you're open to exceptions and open to listening to a correct judgment and getting the Spirit of the Lord to whisper to you, this is okay, and you allow that. So that discrimination and class judgments are not evil in and of themselves. It's only when you cease to use your ample powers to make specific judgments that it becomes evil. When you have the time, and very rarely do you have the time to do that all of the time. So at no single time or version has the Constitution ever served as a fully effective shield. The earlier versions had more loopholes, and the later versions allowed more false rights and government power, and much of this by court interpretation. The other thing is that the Constitution wasn't complex enough and didn't have enough specific language. Now the general language of the Constitution has been inculcated, and we have a little document here. Constitution was on one page. Have you seen it handwritten? It's on one page. Now, if you look at it in a little document, it's about 16 pages, small print, etc. But it was actually handwritten on one big piece of paper. That's all there is. I've rewritten that Constitution in tight legal language, and it takes about 15 pages. You take the same document, and you say, now what do I have to do to stop them from reinterpreting it? So you rewrite it in tight legal language. You can read that, by the way, on my website. If you go to joelskousen.com and you click on Law and Government, I've got a list of things to do. Part of my talk is coming out of the first one on that, and I highly recommend these to you. One is the in defense of the principles of fundamental rights. And I talk about the principles of law, how you establish law from scratch. And you really need to do that, because someday this government that tyrannizes is going to fail in this war that's coming up. And there's going to be anarchy for a period of time. And you're going to get the opportunity to reestablish liberty, even if it's in a small sector of this country. And believe me, you're going to have to know how to do law again from scratch in a different way, because if you don't know, if all you've got is to say, let's go back to the Constitution, and the lawyers say, that doesn't cover this and this and this and this, but we know how to do that, we have all this legal precedent, and what are you going to do to counter that? You see, you've got to have answers. The second answer I gave you, why the Constitution hasn't served, is one that's been interpreted away. But secondly, it's not complex enough. It doesn't cover enough. And there's so much complex law. Bankruptcy law isn't in the Constitution. Most of contract law isn't in the Constitution. Property law, all the nuances of those things. They're just a few little defense statements about no taking of property, but there's been all kinds of interpretations, whole volumes written on these interpretive ones. If you don't understand how to restrict law to the principles that you admire in the Constitution, you're going to be out of luck. It's going to be the mainstream people and lawyers who are going to take it away from you again. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, you don't have any power to stop what they're doing now. You go before the city council and you try to get them from using eminent domain powers to take neighborhood houses for development. You know, they'll say, oh, the Supreme Court already ruled in our favor, so go away. But someday, I'm telling you, you may have the opportunity to start from scratch, and you need to know how to do it. You need to know the principles, so that when they start projecting, oh, we're going to do it like we did here before, and say, no, that's a violation of this principle. No, that's the violation. We need to start with, first of all, with initial unanimous consent. We need to have all of this, and you need to know how to defend those principles, how to make them workable. And I'm going to explain some of those, and they're all on my website. This is part of a future book I've got called Essential Principles of Liberty, or the Foundations of the Ideal State is the actual title. The Foundations of the Ideal State, and that's my whole purpose, is to teach conservatives how to go beyond the basic wonderful principles of the Constitution and put it into good, tight legal language and train them up in the principles so they know how to defend those when they go up against lawyers someday. Now, let's go through and I'll show you, as we celebrate the 10 amendments here, of what's happened to them. Amendment number 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or press or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Let me just go, before I do this, we need to include as part of the Bill of Rights, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which is the habeas corpus law. It says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, or where the public safety may require. Okay? Now, notice it doesn't ever say in a Bill of Rights that there's a Bill of Rights to have habeas corpus, to demand that government bring forth the body and show cause why he shall be imprisoned. All it does is mention that it shall not be suspended. It's like one of those things that tells you what? Everybody knows fundamental right is habeas corpus is a fundamental right. We don't have to list it. We know it. And it shall only be suspended under very limited circumstances. This is an example, however. Cases of rebellion, that means like a civil war. Invasion, massive military problem. You've got lots of prisoners of war. You don't have time to bring them forth all at once in a speedy way. But this last one is a perfect example of what they knew was a generalized phrase, and the courts have driven a truck through, when the public safety may require it. What cannot be justified in the name of public safety? That's what the Bush administration is telling you. We have a threat of terrorism. It's never going away. Will always be a threat to public safety. And therefore, habeas corpus is gone, right? We don't have to do it. We're always at risk. But you have to remember the principle. What's the principle behind these exemptions? The principle is very clear, and it's written in law. It's written in the arguments, and that is that it's because you flood the courts with thousands of prisoners and you just don't have time to get to them. Have we ever had thousands of terrorist suspects that we don't have time to get to? How long would it take to get through 136 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay? See, there's no excuse for suspending habeas corpus, even if they're not citizens. Here's the argument against this principle. They have it both ways. Well, they're not citizens. They don't have right to our habeas corpus. Isn't that right? That's the problem. I mean, Jose Padilla was a citizen, so it was a violation. But they say now they don't have the right at Guantanamo. They're not citizens. But guess what the Supreme Court's argument is about illegal aliens? Can you deny them rights to the courts because they're illegal aliens? Not according to the Supreme Court. They have the rights to all of the things in the Constitution as long as they're setting foot in this land. Do they have the right to welfare, right to public education? Courts say they do. Habeas corpus, they're not citizens. Isn't that incredible? You know, the media is really smart. Have you ever heard this in the media? Have you ever heard them explain this contradiction? Have you ever heard Nina Totenberg on PBS, who's their legal correspondent? She knows this. Has she ever publicly uttered a word about this hypocrisy between the position of the Supreme Court in giving illegal aliens all these constitutional rights but not denying them habeas corpus? I mean, you just can't get away with that. If you would put that before the public, if your Sean Hannity's and Glenn Beck's in the world really understood the Constitution, they'd be shouting to the world this kind of contradiction between the Supreme Court. Now, so habeas corpus is extremely important. Several jurisprudence has said, you know, without habeas corpus, you have nothing. Because without habeas corpus, you can have secret prisons, you can have secret torture, and you can have disappearances, and you'll never know where they went. Argentina. You just disappear. Those desaparecidos. And someday in the United States, we're going to have the disappeared. I don't intend to be one of them. But if I do disappear, I hope you will not just sit in your chair and say, oh, gee, isn't that too bad? He disappeared. I wonder what happened to him. You ought to be pounding at government's door with writs of habeas corpus saying, bring forth the body. We want to see why he's been taken. So amendment number 1 has a whole bunch of it. Make no law respecting establishment of religion. Why was that? They didn't want state churches. Now, it's been reinterpreted as anything that you do to promote anything for religion in general is improper, at least if it's Christian. If it's Muslim, well, we can promote some of that because that's diversity, you see. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, I believe that restricting the free expression, whether it's prayer or other things, by public officials is restricting the free exercise of religion. Why? Because when you elect a public official, you elect him for what he is and what he believes in. And if he starts praying in ways that you don't like, you just don't elect him. But you cannot prohibit him from having freedom of speech and from saying what he wants to do as an elected official. He can pray. But public schooling is a different thing. There is a legitimate argument against praying in public schools. And why is that? Because people like me are being forced to pay for public schools, which I don't use and I don't intend and never do to intend. And so everything they do in public schools is a violation of my rights to my property. Now, you see, the violation is that you take everybody's money and you put it into our education, but it's not our education. It's government education, it's majoritarian education, and all education, ladies and gentlemen, has values. Everything has value. Even science has values. You don't think it does? Wait till you take a biology class about evolution. You start cramming that stuff down your throat. That is a religion. It's based on faith and theory, not facts. But I have to pay for it. And that's where the violation is. So you see, the solution to prayer in schools is you get rid of public funding of schools. They can have public schools, but they have to be user fee. You get rid of public funding, make the people who want those lavish schools pay for those lavish schools. And then they can pray or they can not pray, because if you don't like it, you go and you form your own school or you homeschool. And you do it much cheaper. Now that's the answer. It is not putting putting prayer back in public schools. The reason that isn't appropriate is because you are saying, and you've got to think, and any time you get behind a law, or a legislative thing, you've got to think, what's the generalized law? What's the principle of law that I'm backing here? What's the principle of it? It means that we, the majority, have the right to determine the moral values of education, of everybody, and everybody has to pay for our decision. That's the generalized principle. And we don't believe in that. We do not believe that we have the power to force Muslims to pay taxes to school and have only a certain amount of prayer that excludes them. Now, if you allow everybody to pray, then we sit around saying prayers to give every one of the taxpayers. So that doesn't work. The real reason is you just stop taking everybody's taxes. Then it's not a violation of anybody's rights. And you stop making school mandatory, by the way. And that's another principle. You do not make mandatory by government things which the failure to comply with is not a violation of anybody's rights. Think about that. It's like motorcycle helmet laws. If I fail to wear a motorcycle helmet, am I violating anyone else's rights? Therefore, it is not in the power of government to make me do something that they think is good for me, because that's an unlimited power of lawmaking, unlimited extension of lawmaking power. And I'll give you an example. If not helmets, then why not titanium shafts? I mean, isn't that great protection? Skid down the highway on a fall and you won't even be hurt. They only cost $20,000 a pair. What price safety? You see the fallacy of starting down that road of determining, why not 3 glasses of milk? Everybody shall have them. And you know, we do something like that. We're mandated to fluoridate water supply because people think it's good for you, even though it's not. It's a poison. And that's an example how do-gooder stuff really gets bad, is when what some people think is good for you is in fact another person's poison. And you fail to have a choice in it. So these are the things that you have to worry about. And you have to understand the principles. And that's a very important legal lesson that you should know. It's not about whether or not everyone should have health care. I never used the establishment medical system. I believe in good nutrition, organic, healthful living, and I know how to cure things. And my wife and I and our family, we just don't use the medical profession. And they don't cover anything that we use, even if we had health insurance. They don't cover it. You have to go to the doctor and take their drugs, or they won't pay for it. Now, but that's still not the principle. The principle is, when you mandate that everyone have insurance, what are you doing? In principle, you're saying government has the right to tell you what they think is good for you. When failure to have insurance is no violation of anybody's rights. But the government will come back, and these brainless legislators, and they will say, but if you have a health problem that you can't pay for it, it's going to come back on the public, and the public's going to have to pay for it. Therefore, we can mandate that you must have health insurance. Now, you've got to know a little bit of law and principles to know what's wrong with that. You've got to know a little bit of law. Let me give you another example to make it perfectly clear of how egregious that statement is and how laughable in a legal sense. If I were to come to your house, let's take George's house. He's still alive. And I'm saying, George, I'm going to do a great thing for you. I'm going to pay for your health insurance. Just going to pay for it. You don't have to say yes or no. I'm just going to pay for it. But I'm going to come into your house and inspect and make sure that everything you eat is according to my, specifications and standards, and you must abide by those. Is that a legal contract? Is that a legal contract? Can I bind him because I'm paying for his health insurance? Why not? Because he didn't agree to it. Now, they will come back and say, but you guys voted for these councilmen, these legislators, and by voting, you have tacitly agreed. I said, wait a minute, I never voted for any of these people. I've never voted for anyone who's ever won an election. But if you did, you still would not be bound. You would still not be bound because this is still, a generalized, this is what's called a unilateral contract in contract law. It's a one-way contract. You have to have two parties to make a legitimate, and you have to give consideration. Consideration means you have to give me value in return for me to pay value to, and for me to bind you then. We have to have a mutual where I'm getting some benefit. But in essence, you have to be able to understand how to counter these legislators. And I have written emails to them, got no response from these people. I've explained to them very clearly the principle. And I even gave them a religious argument, because all of these people are members of the LDS Church, as am I. And I said, what you need to understand is this is a very serious violation of the principles of the war in heaven, of which we fought for and agreed upon to come to this earth life. And you ought to be ashamed, because someday you're going to be very embarrassed when you get on the other side. Do you understand that principle? What was the plan of Satan? We will use government power to force people to do what is right, so that everybody comes back and we save everyone. Was that a popular plan? You bet that was popular. It was only unpopular with God because He says, what good are you if you come back? And you've all been good because you've been forced to be good. I've sent you down there to be tested. You see? And that's why it's a violation of the principles of the war in heaven. We should never use government force or power to coerce anybody to do anything unless what? It is a violation of someone else's fundamental rights. Now, that's a very important principle to understand. That's the entire limitations of government. In one sentence, everything that government does, the only thing it can do is to protect people from violations of their fundamental rights. Now, it is a difference to say that the role of government is to protect you from harm or danger or risk. Now, those appear to be negatives, don't they? But they are not necessarily violations of your fundamental rights. For example, I may do harm to my neighbor economically by painting my house pink. Think about that. Can he sell his house next to my pink monstrosity? So I am harming him economically, am I not? Does he have a right to not be harmed by the views around him? Now think about that. Does he have a right? Because if he does, that means he has the right to control all the views around him. You see how this gets into a little bit of complex law, okay? But you have to ask these kinds of questions to understand if it's a true right or not. And we say, oh, no, I'm not going to give him the right to control what everybody's house color is and what everybody's bushes are planted, because these are conflicting rights. If he has that right and I have the right to control everyone's house that I see, can you imagine what that's going to do? There's no way to adjudicate those conflicts. So those cannot be rights. So I'm going to give you the definition of fundamental rights. This is a gold mine. If you know this definition, you can argue anybody down on false rights. Fundamental rights are those rights which all people can simultaneously claim without forcing someone to serve their needs. It's in my writings on my website if you don't want to write this down. But fundamental rights are those rights which everyone can simultaneously claim without forcing someone to serve their needs. Now, I developed that definition after many months of thinking it through and discarding one definition after another to get to a point of how can you sufficiently define fundamental rights that keeps people from creating false rights. Let me give you some examples of how this works. How about the right of, these are the false fundamental rights that we're paraded with all the time, the rights to a free public education. Now, almost everybody assumes that's a right. You start to deny or take funding away from public schools, as we saw in this voucher debate. And what were the public school people? This is a violation of the fundamental rights of everyone to a free public education at your taxpayer expense. And we're mad as hell because a little of that money is going to be taken off. Even if they're going to make it up to us, we just don't like it that it's going somewhere else that we can't control. How about the fundamental right to a free public education? Apply the definition. Let's make everybody simultaneously claim the right to have a free public education And nobody can be forced to provide any or to serve our needs for that. Okay? So everybody's going to claim to be educated at one time. Now, who's going to provide the building? Who's going to teach? It's my right, so I've got the right to force you to teach, right? And force you to build buildings for me. No. You see how that can't be a fundamental right? Because you have to force people. How about health care? Is that a fundamental right to have basic health care? No, because everybody can't simultaneously claim it. Who's going to provide the service? See, it's inherently conflicting because you have to force someone to provide the service. All right, how about the fundamental right to life? Can everyone simultaneously claim the right to live without forcing anyone to serve their needs? Except what? Children, babies. Okay? And defense, he mentioned. And that's a legitimate, in other words, your right to life, when you start to threaten mine, I can use my right to life to remove your threat, even up to the taking of your life.
No, I didn't say defense. I said infants.
Oh, infants. You were right. Okay.
That was good that I had an answer that was good.
Infants and children. Why? Because they cannot live without it. And this goes to the right of contract. All right? These are mutually. See, we can bind parents to take care of those children till they reach an age of self-sufficiency, can't we? Why? Because they engaged in a mutual contract to have sexual relations which engendered the child, which he had no choice in. All right? So this is a very important argument about abortion. They talk about free to choose. Well, you actually exercised your right of choice already when you engaged in sexual relations. And when you do so, you cannot absolve yourself of the consequences of that choice any more than you can absolve yourself of the consequences of driving your vehicle through the fence of your neighbor and drive away. You have a third party, innocent party, that has been damaged by your action, and therefore you now have a binding contract with the innocent third party. Now that's the principle of law that binds people to sustain their child and are not allowed from conception, because you have started the process of life. It doesn't matter if it's fully. So they're not self-sufficient as babies even after they're born. But you say you have caused a contract, and so both people are liable to support that child, to support his right, because you created it through a contract, and you are not free to disavow that contract. So these are some important ways to think through law. Let me cover a couple of things in the First Amendment here. The freedom of the press, that's very important. Freedom of speech. And by the way, freedom of... Yes, did you have a question? Definition of fundamental right is something that everyone can simultaneously claim without forcing others to serve their needs. So, can everyone claim the right to property that they have earned by their own effort? Can everyone claim the right to a separate piece of property they've earned by their own effort? In other words, they haven't taken, they've earned by their own effort. Can everyone claim it? Yes, you can, because it's non-conflicting, isn't it? See, all true fundamental rights are non-conflicting. How about the right to contract? Can anyone contract with another person voluntarily? Is that a fundamental right? Yes, because it's non-conflicting. If the key is voluntary. Now, you can't force a person to contract. That's what anti-discrimination laws do. It violates the freedom of contract. Can everyone claim the right to disassociate themselves from any other person? Yes, they can. They don't violate anybody by refusal, except for children. That's why families are a different category. And you have certain responsibilities of parents that we're talking about sovereign individuals and fundamental rights, not children who are under that. Can everyone claim the right to worship God as they please? As long as that worship doesn't entail the infringement upon rights of other people, right? So you can't have human sacrifice of involuntary. Could you have voluntary sacrifice? You actually could. Now, this brings up a legal technicality, which the founders were somewhat working under a religious assumption here, they use the words inalienable rights. Have you ever heard that? That these are the inalienable rights of man? How many have heard that before? Okay. Do you know what that means, inalienable? Most people think that it means that it can't be violated by government. Is that right? Can't be taken away, inalienable, but that's not what it means. It comes from the religious definition. This was a curious religious principle, ancient principle, that because it was a right given to God, God gave it out, that it was, you couldn't even give it away. You couldn't take your life. You couldn't do anything. You can't give these rights. You can't sell them. That's what inalienable, you can't alienate them is in the original legal terminology of get rid of it. To alienate it from yourself, sell it, give it away, or take your life. But it's an improper thing. In fact, you can alienate your fundamental rights. You can sell yourself into slavery. You do so every time you take a mortgage on your house. And you do that. And it's a legitimate thing. You can give away. In fact, the Lord even allows you to take your own life. Now, He doesn't like it. He has commanded you not to do it. But you're free to do so, by the way. The Lord won't stop you. So you can alienate every one of your fundamental rights. So it's an improper principle. And there's a lot of things about God-given rights and natural rights. The reason why I make a lot of I take some attention to address the fact of why it is not appropriate to try to make the stand on fundamental rights based upon God-given rights. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis of that. It's a very weak position because in the first place, God doesn't like it. And the reason I'm saying that is God likes liberty. It's true. And He likes your rights, and He's inspired all of the people to defend those rights. But He doesn't want to do it because God said so, because this is an earth test. You can't find for me anywhere in the Scriptures where He lists inalienable rights. Now, you can stretch and interpret the Scripture, talk about thou shalt not kill, and therefore there's a fundamental right to life. You can make those types of things. But what do you do with people who don't believe that God ever revealed the Ten Commandments? How do you form a government with those people? And most people who are Christians in this nation, well, just accept it. It's not going to do you any harm. These are the rights that God set down. But in fact, God never did list them. Men have done it by interpretation. They've done a fairly poor job of it, by the way, because there are many Christians who believe in inalienable rights of God-given rights and include education and health care and those things too, and don't understand those are also violations of people's property rights. But it's actually totally unnecessary to go to all that scriptural interpretation to try to define rights as God-given rights. Because when you have a definition as I've given that's and you know the principles of law, is that to get together and form a government, we simply have to agree on something where all of our rights, legitimate rights, are protected, that we have established a legal system which resolves conflicts. That's a very important system. Ours is not a free market economy is not about economics at all. Government has nothing to do with economics. Free market economics is simply a legal system that stops conflicts between people and business and private parties and contracts. That's all that the government does to establish a free market. The free market is, in fact, the only system that is an absence of an economic system. There's no economic system. There's no regulation, no control, but there's only legal structures to keep people from aggressing against one another. That's all the free market is. It's a legal structure. Now, but the point is, if you force everyone to base their joining government on accepting God and as the basis of rights, you're going to have conflict from the very beginning. If you start from the basis, let's lay out a system of fundamental rights that all of us can agree on. And frankly, there are people that won't agree on what I'm saying. That is, they'll want to take your money for public education, even if it's a violation of your rights, because they think they know better. In fact, every person in the public school administration has that mentality that we know better. We are professional educators, and you're going to pay for it, whether you like it or not, because it's good for society. Well, it's also good that we have a well-fed society. Are we about to have a public feeding system too, because it's for the good of society, and you're going to pay for it? It's the same principle of law, isn't it? So the important thing that we have to realize is that we have to have a system of laws and principles that are non-conflicting. Socialism is inherently conflicting, isn't it? Because we're all competing to take a part of your productive pie and your productive pie. And that's why socialism never works in Bosnia and Kosovo, where you have these multi-ethnic groups, or in Iraq, where you have 3 ethnic groups. They're all trying to get a piece of the oil pie in Iraq, aren't they? If you had a true constitutional system where nobody had a right to that oil except the people who owned the oil, then there's no conflict, is there? You own what you own. And if the government happens to own the oil, the people bought the oil rights, then they can divide it up as a public corporation with all the public people as shareholders, but it can be done on private property principles rather than on socialism, which is whoever can control this government can get all the oil for their own people. And that's why you have inherently conflicting competition in the socialist model. But I'm getting far astray. Let me continue with the Bill of Rights. It's very important that we get through this. But the right to peaceably assemble is very important, and that's being restricted right now by the Bush administration, because you are having assembly, if it's for political purposes, in caged communities, fenced-in areas, away from the president, away from the Bilderbergers, away from the members of Congress, so that they cannot, in fact, protest. There have been people who have been battling the IRS for years who have demanded to put their petition before Congress because the courts will not uphold it and the IRS will not uphold it, and it's a redress of grievance. Notice in this First Amendment you have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That means you have the right to get that petition to members of Congress if the other points of the establishment are not accepting it. And those people are literally prohibited from giving their petitions to Congress. That's a violation of the Constitution. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people, not the right of the militia. The right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, this does have one problem, and that is the sense, as you know, that how much weaponry is sufficient for self-defense. As a libertarian, I can say that almost anything necessary to stop government tyranny. But what about the people who want to build a little atom bomb and keep it in their attic? You know, there can reach a point where there's going to be an imminent threat to people around you from that. So there are some legal difficulties with unlimited rights to how many weapons. It's just like driving. There is a legitimate legal structure for stopping people from speeding too much on the highways. And it's the imminent threat doctrine. Under normal law, we do not allow people to be prosecuted unless they've actually damaged someone, created a victim or a crime. Is that right? But what about a drunk driver? Can you afford to wait till he hits somebody when he's weaving all over the road? No, you have to stop him before. That's called a priori restraint. Restraint before he violates the law. Is it a justifiable principle? It is, because he is an imminent threat. Now, you have to be careful of some of those doctrines because it can be used. I could be viewed as an imminent threat to the Bush administration because I intend to stop them. Ron Paul is an imminent threat to the globalists. He intends to stop them. But it's not a violation of anyone's right. He's actually in favor of our rights. So we're not truly a threat to anyone's right. We are a threat to people who are evil, just as a judge is a threat to a criminal. So that's a different thing. But you see, a drunk driver is an imminent threat to the right of life and the right of property and contract and a lot of other things to other people. And so we have the right to stop him because he is an imminent threat. And you have to carefully define imminent threat in law so that it can't go too far astray. But I lost my original train of thought. Oh, yes, the Second Amendment. So you have to understand that certain times people can be viewed, gathering weapons, etc., as an imminent threat when it's obviously far beyond when they're going to stage a revolution or other things, when you can intervene. But you have to be very careful in writing these cases in law. As the lawyers have often said, tough cases make bad law. Bad law often gets written because of the tough cases where you're trying to cover everything. And that's why ultimately there are some things that have to be done by judges. You just have to judge because they can't be perfectly written in law. The Third Amendment is on quartering troops in any houses, and that's pretty obsolete. Could become a problem in the future, but it's more a case of taking over whole towns now in cities with martial law, which is the problem rather than quartering in houses. The Fourth Amendment, very powerful. It's nearly gone now. Fourth Amendment, against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Listen to this language. No warrants shall be issued, but upon probable cause. That means you got to go before the judge and show probable cause, supported by an oath. That means if this is wrong, I've sworn that it's true, and if I'm lying, you go to jail, Mr. Policeman. Affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, the persons to be searched, and things to be seized. Now, have you ever heard of general bench warrants now? They come with a general warrant. It doesn't state the person to be seized. It doesn't state even the address. Just waiving a general drug search warrant. Just illegal. Unconstitutional. And they've just written it away. Now, what about unreasonable searches and seizures and telephone surveillance, etc.? As I've explained in my World Affairs brief many times, this whole argument about the FISA court, this secret federal surveillance court, which gets secret evidence, secret probable cause, and issues warrants, is just a facade. They, in fact, are surveilling everything. Echelon's been doing it for years. The telephone company's been involved for years with surveillance. NSA has wiretaps on all the new fiber optics. They have splitters in them. One goes to the NSA computers, and they're taking everything coming down the internet, every email. It's all being recorded. And they occasionally take a few with probably going to take it to a warrant on a judge, some 18,000 per year, but it's just for show. They got millions, and they're surveilling everything. How do you think they get the evidence for the warrant? They're already surveilling. So it's just a fraud. This whole thing about passing legislation is built on the premise that they're not doing, that they're trying to surveil, and we're worried about them trying to. It's already been done for years. Can't trust anything they say. That's what I call the dark side of government. So much for the Fourth Amendment. So the First Amendment, you got some freedom of religion, and they'll keep giving you that right up to the very end just because people tend to think they're free. Lost a lot of freedom of speech with the restrictions on speech, campaign financing reform. We're not allowed, that's why Ron Paul made that statement, I'm not allowed to be connected with you at all in any way. Because we're not, so many days before an election, allowed to propagate or do anything in a public realm that promotes or denies people's opinions about certain things. So that's a real violation of free speech, First Amendment. Now the Fifth Amendment, this has been undermined seriously. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or infamous crime unless presentment or indictment to a grand jury. Now, grand juries are very much controlled now, controlled by the prosecutor. They tell them what to believe, what to think is, what the law is. How many have served on a grand jury? Well, very few people get to serve on grand juries, but there was a grand jury about Oklahoma City bombing, and there was one person on there who really wasn't buying what the prosecutor says. I want to see John Doe number 2. You've got him in custody. Bring him before this grand jury. They removed him off the grand jury. And that gave a signal to the rest of the people, be compliant or you'll be removed too. And except in cases arising in war or time of public danger. Once again, that general phrase, you can't do away with having to go through a grand jury. You shall not make any person subject twice or put him in jeopardy of life and limb. That's double jeopardy. Can't try him safe. That's a very good thing that still is generally ruled that has not been violated. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That's still in force. The Fifth Amendment has not been broken yet. Nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, there's no real safety in that due process because when law becomes corrupt, then we're following the law. And what is the law of the land now? It says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And now the Supreme Court has ruled that public use means anything the government wants to do with your property. You see, you can't afford to have, general language like that. You have to write constitutions in ways that they cannot get around. So I think you'll find, those of you who have interest, read the constitutional rewrite that I've done, and you'll see, boy, that stops them there. Oh, yeah, that stops them there. They can't do that. I mean, the government would just hate that Constitution. Amendment number 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, not secret trials, public trials, by an impartial jury of the state and jurisdiction. You know, the legal profession has created all kinds of special rules for seating a jury. Have you ever been through a jury selection process? Boy, I'll tell you, they see anybody sharp, who's got legal training, get him off. I'll use my preemptive, I don't like this guy. He's obviously, they want dumb people. They want people who will go along with what they say, who are manipulable. And this is totally unconstitutional. And the person accused shall be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with witnesses against him. This is all very powerful stuff, all from the common law. And to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses. That's what discovery is all about. Discovery is the right to be able to compel with subpoena, to go out with your lawyer saying, I want to get him to testify and him to testify and him to testify, put him under oath, and go out and hire a private investigator. You've got to have ability, even if you can't afford, to compel people to come and testify on your behalf when you're in jail.
If you've ever had interacted with a DCFS or family services, you have no rights. None of it. Your family can't even come to the court.
That's right, because it's really not that they're accusing. You see, if they could only take your children because you were accused of a wrongdoing, they'd be in hot water because they have hardly anything to ever accuse these parents of. They actually take away and make you prove that you're competent to get them back. And so it's just really reversed. And so you have no rights because you're not the accused. We're not accusing you of anything. Not specifically.
How do you square the right of the accused to compel somebody to testify with the fundamental rights of that person that's being compelled to testify?
You mean like a Fifth Amendment, right?
Well, that's only...
It's not a Fifth Amendment. How can you force him against his will to testify?
This is a very good point. Technically, under my principles, you can't. All right. So what I do when I get into my legal structure, when I found this big hole, is that society doesn't work together if you don't pre-agree to yield some of these fundamental liberties that you have in order to make society work better. For example, let's take eminent domain. I'm not a real big fan of eminent domain, but there are certain reasons why you need to have it. If you've got a mountain pass, you own the river and the pasture through there, and there's way for a roadway, and there's only one way to get between this valley and that valley. One person who owns the land can hold out forever in his, Those holdout type of situations are the kind of tough cases that make for bad law. And so they say, well, we've got to have the right to override people's property rights. Well, I say, no, you can't give. There's no way to write in general law that property right is inviolable except when the government needs it really bad. I mean, they can always say they need it really bad. And that's what they're doing right now. But what you can do is say, this is why you need what I call the principle of covenant government. You start with initial unanimous consent. It doesn't mean that you have to have everybody in the world agree. It means, let's suppose we start with us. We're going to form our own little country. We have war going on around us. We're going to all meet in a certain area where we have contiguous boundaries, and we are going to start a new land, and we're going to be free. And the only people we're going to accept in this area are people who all agree with this basic, to agree that these are the fundamental rights. We're going to list them what they are. This is the constitutional document. And if you don't like it, then don't join. But we're going to start with as many people as we can. And part of our covenant or our compact, like a Mayflower compact, is we say, We agree that when we are required to testify or serve on a jury, we agree that we'll yield our fundamental right not to participate in order to the working better. But we pre-agree on specific things. They're listed, and you have a right to not join or join. And they should be reasonable, and they're going to have to be reasonable, or most people aren't going to join. I mean, you can get an exclusive club of maybe us four and agree, but we want something that will attract more people. So we're going to have a little compromise. We might agree to have everybody learns to fire a firearm, unless they're incapacitated or et cetera, so that everybody has some self-defense training. We might agree to a draft. A draft is a violation of your fundamental rights. But we might agree as part of our citizen covenant to serve under specific circumstances when the fundamental rights are violated, when the threat reaches a certain threshold, etc., so that it's safe, so that it's not this generalized stuff. So this is the answer to your question, is that sometimes we have to covenant, like you have a covenant community where you want a higher level of standards, but you don't impose those standards on other people. You just say, if you want to live here in this neighborhood, we live by these covenants. That's an appropriate way to get around some of these difficult questions of law. That's right. That's right. This is something that I believe, and technically a constitution, and the founders knew this doctrine of initial unanimous consent. You'll notice that the founding fathers did not require that the Constitution be accepted by any state that didn't want to. And initially, only about 2/3 of the states came on board. Then what happened? The rest of them said, I don't want to be on the outside. Look at how they're growing. They've got commerce going. They've got a judicial system. They've got order. They've got peace. They're starting to collect taxes peacefully. We better be part of that. And so they started to join, and all the states finally joined. That's what would happen in my system of what I'm saying is that how you start a true libertarian conservative government. Well, you start with initial unanimous consent, and you start to build a society that starts to prosper more than those around you, and everybody else wants to join it. Well, if you want to join, then you have to sign the covenant. You have to take a test. You have to agree to certain fundamental rights. And I believe in citizenship by covenant as well. I don't believe in citizenship by birth. Now, I believe it ought to be easy enough to become a citizen, that everybody can pass. It's an open book test. I mean, you can't have the book there, but you can read all the answers, etc. required. We just want people to know what the fundamental rights are. And then to be a citizen, they've got to sign on the dotted line that they will not knowingly violate other people's fundamental rights. You see, then you've got cause against someone who wants to become a communist and take away your rights. You're no longer a citizen. You've just lost your citizenship because you're attempting and you're putting forth a philosophy to take away people's fundamental rights. So you can still do that, but you can't do it as a citizen. Now, can you still live there? Yes, you can have a residency who's not a citizen, and you can maybe rent things, but a citizen will have rights of ownership, and they're protected, and they have the right to vote. So you don't let people vote away your liberty. And this is one of the other flaws of the Constitution. You've got unlimited amendment power. If you get a big enough majority, they can literally take away the Constitution. And that you should never allow fundamental rights to be voted upon. Do you understand that principle? Fundamental rights are fundamental rights. They cannot be voted away no matter how big a majority. So how do you establish fundamental rights? You do it by initial unanimous consent. You all say, we agree. You're right, Mr. Skousen. These are the rights that we ought to do. Or you're wrong about this, and we agree that we'll add 2 or 3 more, and we start a community. And if we ever change those rights, we have to all unanimously agree. Certain things have to start and end with unanimous consent. It's a very important principle. The founders knew that. They didn't force any of the states to become part of the Constitution unless they wanted to, but the states themselves failed to let their people ratify it. So you see, initial unanimous consent is very important to start. Question up there.
Well, I was just going to say, do you think that a citizens' initiative could restore the concept of prevailing as a stewardship that each person, in order to vote, would have a compliance with liberty and the Constitution, just as 2 principles, that in order to have the rights of citizenship, they would have to take an affirmation or an oath to support liberty and the Constitution? I mean, I think that would work.
I think that's too easy. I have a list in my writings, by the way, of what a typical citizen's contract might have. And, for example, I may have a different tax system so that it's related directly. You only pay for government services that you actually use, so that you're not, making softball parks and having everybody pay for it and only a small portion use it, things like that. So it's really a fair taxation system. And people have to be up to date on their taxes. They can't be guilty of violating the law. If they're going to exercise their right to vote, they have to. But just to affirm that you're going to be liberated, Bill Clinton can affirm that. George Bush can affirm that he's going to abide by the Constitution. So and of course he did.
He did.
And he violates it. So I just think that's a little bit too easy.
Don't you think the amendment, the First Amendment that guarantees the citizen the right of liberty to hold their representatives to accountability? Do you think the citizens can unite and say, these are usurpations or violations of the Constitution? We as citizens are uniting and requesting or ordered to show cause why you haven't violated our rights.
I believe there is and I've devised such a system. I believe in 4 branches of government. There's got to be an executive, there's got to be a legislative, a judicial, and the citizens themselves. Just like if a citizen of referendum, there ought to be a way where the citizens, if the Congress won't impeach the president, that the citizens with a certain power can impeach judges or president, just take them out. So I think there needs to be 4. They need to have enforcement powers, each one. Enforcement powers of citizens is everybody's armed, or at least everybody's free to be armed. And I think even the Supreme Court ought to have powers of enforcement so that President Roosevelt can't thumb his nose about it and say, let them enforce their judicial rulings on it.
Don't we have that through our state legislatures? And that's another way to implement impeachment in the Constitution.
Yes, you can do that too with the body of a certain percentage of states and their legislatures to rule on those as representatives of the people. But ultimately, just as we've found in state government, state legislators don't always represent. The important thing that you have to realize, though, about all of these things is that professional legislators can be flawed. People can be flawed, just like how many people voted against vouchers. And even though vouchers was not a pure good solution to the education, because it was still taking my tax money for other people's private schools. But nevertheless, it was still a step in taking away, or at least the monopoly on tax monies of the public school. And I wanted that established, that principle, that the public schools don't have the total monopoly on tax money, that private individuals have a right to some of that tax money. That's a step in the right direction. I actually believe that nobody has the right, of any of that tax money. But you see how you can start. It was, and government would have, although this particular bill did not regulate very much. That was one of the public schools' complaints. We want more regulation. They don't want to give up that power. And it would have been a danger, but I still felt that on balance, if you start the principle of getting money away from the public schools so that they can't ever more claim that we have the exclusive right to speak for all taxpayers' money, then you can fight the battle of let us be free once you've got some money. And if you lose it, you can always just say, I'm not taking the money, I'm going to homeschool. There was a lot of problems with the bill, but it was the philosophy that even the voucher side couldn't stop from praising the public schools and our wonderful system, and this is going to help them, this is going to get more money. I mean, talk about lack of principles. No one had the courage to stand up and say the system is corrupt. We want our freedom. Don't tread on me. Too much money involved. Let me go through, and then I'll open up some questions here. So the Sixth Amendment about an impartial jury has been probably denigrated most of all by empowering judges to instruct the jury with mandatory instructions. This should never have been allowed. The jury is allowed under the law, common law, to judge both the facts of the case and the law itself of whether or not it's appropriate. Now, they cannot negate any law legislatively. They cannot say the law is unconstitutional across the board. They can say, we say this individual use of the law is only the legislature or the courts can say it's a wrong law. But they can say, we will not enforce because it's inappropriate in this case, or the law is inappropriate, period. But in this particular case, we have the power to say we will not enforce. It's an absolute right of a jury that must by acquitting. By acquitting. That's right. So that's been, and what has also been undermined is the next amendment where suits at common law, which means civil cases, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, and that's never been changed, by the way. But now the courts have arbitrarily changed the amount to $5,000 and $7,000 that you don't have the right to a trial by jury. The right of a trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined by any court, and we have courts now overruling juries, and it's absolutely unconstitutional. So you see, we come here to celebrate the Bill of Rights, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm here to tell you that over half of the Bill of Rights is already gone. They're only giving us what is still convenient for them, and half of that is so that we don't catch on that in fact we've lost the Constitution already. They're only abiding by it, that is the judges that are deep into this conspiracy, to continue to convince you people that we're a government of law. Amendment 8, excessive bail, fines, or cruel and unusual punishments are enjoined. Of course, they're taking cruel and unusual punishment to almost outlaw all punishment now, which obviously wasn't the intent of the founders, who had even lashing as a non-cruel and unusual punishment in those days. And, of course, the 9th and 10th Amendments are the two most powerful amendments, and they've been totally disregarded. The 9th Amendment, the enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Unfortunately, they couldn't come to a definition of what those rights were. Had they done that, it would have helped. But they left it open. At least they said, we want to make sure. And that's all they were saying. There were some that feared that this listing of Bill of Rights would say that's all the rights that there are. They were affirming that there are other rights that are not listed here. But they didn't help us out by telling us what they were, giving us a definition. And as you know, that's why we've got false rights today. And the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, that's the issue of states' rights, isn't it? What's left to the people? The states took all the rest. The state governments won't let you have any rights. They want all the rest, if there are any. And that's the problem with lack of definition again. If you read my revised Constitution, which I do to boost these things, nothing's left to chance like that. It's very interesting. Let me see if there's something else that I wanted to talked about that. Let me just cover briefly the basic principles of non-conflicting principles, how you base a new structure of government on. That each individual capable of being self-responsible, so we're not talking about infants, can rightfully claim as fundamental rights any action or state of being that others can simultaneously claim without forcing others to serve their needs. In other words, you can do anything you want as long as you're not infringing on other people's rights. Individual sovereignty is the underlying authority behind every legitimate form of government operation. In other words, if an individual can't do it, government can't do it. And because individuals may use their collective rights, such as self-defense, to give the right to the government to enforce their defense rights, does not mean that they give up their self-defense rights in the process. So the principle that police have the monopoly on power and that citizens are incapable of using it because they gave it to police is absolutely incorrect. Families have a special and temporary form of sovereignty over the health, welfare, and education of their children until those children are capable of being responsible for themselves. There are some difficult areas of child and family law, which I cover in my brief, which I won't get into here. I've covered this. The only proper way to establish a government among free and sovereign individuals with police powers of enforcement is by initial unanimous consent. We all have to agree. Nobody can be brought into a government by majority rule. What you do is you have everyone who becomes citizens, fine, and the rest are residents. You don't take away what property they have, but they don't have the rights that you protect as citizens until they make the covenant to join. And when your children are born, they're not citizens, except as they are citizens under you. But once they become of age, they have to qualify for their own citizenship. It's not automatic. They have to pass the test, they have to sign the covenants, and they have to agree. And so you have no more illegal or ignorant voters that are taking away your rights. Everybody's educated. Everybody's educated. And so you can even undo bad education. You don't have to force the public schools or the private schools to educate. You just have a door. You say, if you want to get through this door, so if you want to be able to own property, own a car, etc., do all those things and have a business, and those, if you want to own those things, which you have to be a citizen, to come through that door, you've got to take the test. Here's the book. All the answers are in there. There's no excuse, except you've got to learn to read and write. There is a means test. I don't mean money, but I mean you got to have some knowledge, intelligence, and commitment to become a citizen, as it should be. And nothing done under government authority has any validity if it violates or limits the fundamental rights of man as defined in the Citizen Covenant. Well, I think we've covered enough law. There's the Bill of Rights has given us 200 years of liberty. It's half gone now, and they're trying to get the rest of it away from us. That's how our situation is very serious. So I'll entertain some questions at this point to see if you've got any ideas about how we can help or win this battle.
You're called to a jury. What do you tell the judge if he tells you what this is used for evidence?
I always tell a judge when I'm doing that I think that you ought to know that I believe that a jury has the right to judge both the facts and whether the law is applicable in this situation. And every time they've said, you're dismissed, Mr. Skousen. They don't want you on the jury.
Why wouldn't you say that? Why wouldn't you keep that to yourself and then exercise those powers?
You can do that.
I just wonder if that's your own personal strategy of being dismissed.
It depends on whether I like the case or not. I mean, sometimes I've been silent just because I want to be on that case to be able to have some influence. But if it's just a waste of my time, and it is a form of involuntary servitude, by the way it's established now. I mean, I travel all of the time, and for me to take out, and they say, we want you to be eligible for jury service for 3 months, I said, I just can't serve. I mean, a 3-month period. So they have accommodated by saying, give me a specific case in a specific time, but I can't be available for 3 months. Am I to, lose my business because I can't travel?
I want to go back to a principle that you talked about with the Second Amendment, and that is, this imminent
Threat.
It seems to me that there's a big problem with that in the sense that let me say that I've never driven drunk, I don't drink, I'm not a proponent of drunk driving, but I don't see how that squares also with, if they're driving drunk, they haven't hurt anyone. If they do violate someone's rights, then they are accountable, responsible, and suffer the consequences. I don't understand how that...
How imminent threat can be used there?
I know that Murray Rothbard in Ethics of Liberty talks about this quite a bit, and he would take a complete opposite view of,
Well, there are many cases where we do want to say, where we can say, for example, like pornography. Pornography is a victimless crime until it drives them to rape, okay? And, social conservatives say, well, we can interdict them and make sure that no one ever watches any pornography. And it's pretty difficult because you can engender your own pornography in your mind and get to rape, even without reading those type of things. So it's not a real prohibition. I prefer in the case of pornography to say, because it's actually always intentional. There's no accidental driving across the center line and raping somebody. Do you know what I mean? But with drunk driving, you really are out of control. You are not able at a certain level, and that's why it is appropriate. It is appropriate to have certain alcohol levels because you can scientifically say, all right, this is a threshold where 60 or 70% of people at this threshold are going to be incapable of exercising good judgment to stop from killing someone.
Can't the government say, if I see somebody driving and they've got a screaming baby in the backseat and the mother is distracted, that's an imminent threat and we can regulate that? I mean, I see that as a result as far as...
That's why I say these...
How are you going to know who is driving unless you're going to stop everybody at checkpoint?
Oh, no. Now, see, obviously there has to be probable cause, and probable cause is weaving around, or if you stop them for some other reason and he can't stand up and other things. I mean, this is pretty well established in law, and I think it's pretty fair. What I object to is the lack of real consequences. I think we'd have I believe in heightening the consequences and allowing a little more leeway. But not in drunk driving. I believe in these thresholds. They've been pretty accurate, and the people, when they cross those thresholds, I mean, some people are pretty unstable below the threshold even. But and there's a few people who hold their liquor better, and even above the threshold, they can make it home. But still, I think it's a workable system, and it is truly an imminent threat. And when you see how much drunk driving it is, how much of a percentage of accidents, I mean, it literally is something that I think we're justified in saying this is an imminent threat. Now, in Second Amendment, however, it has to be very carefully defined because you can't write the law such that, well, this person's doesn't like what's going on in the legislature, so we're going to restrict his right to bear arms. You actually have to divide it in the sense that he's out there with weapons, heading out. He's swearing, he's threatening, and there's got to be several other things that show that you can intervene. And we can't even today on imminent threat. Somebody out there with a gun, shooting it off and things, they can go and arrest him. The Second Amendment right isn't going to protect them there.
So, I mean, I guess the only issue I would take with that is, if a guy wants to have a nuclear weapon in his home or have a tank in his backyard, if he's not, I mean, that isn't necessarily...
I agree. It isn't necessarily. So it has to be something that defines that as an imminent threat. Because otherwise, government doesn't want to have anyone to have automatic weapons, and that doesn't. I mean, it ought to be clearly defined, and it is in mine, Constitution, that the purpose of a Second Amendment is to guard against government tyranny, and you shall never disarm the citizen because they are the primary defense against government tyranny, and they have a right to have whatever weapons necessary to stop government tyranny. But you'll have to write the law such that you can stop criminal activity from using those things, and it's not easy in those areas. Sir, you had a question.
I have a question. It used to be, and my understanding many years ago, that a person was always innocent until proven guilty. Today, it's you're guilty until proven innocent, and it's your problem to prove your innocence. When did that change?
It depends on the type of case. In criminal law, it's still innocent until proven guilty. But on civil cases, or like in the case of parental custody cases, it's you're guilty unless you prove to us that you're competent. How do you prove that you're competent? You go to counseling. You have a psychiatrist sign off that you're a competent parent, and if he doesn't like the way you discipline, he's not going to sign off. I mean, it's just we have lost certain rights, but they're in civil areas and in family law that we've lost those rights, not necessarily in criminal law. Now, when it comes to terrorism, yes, now you've crossed over, and terrorists are guilty until they prove themselves innocent. Like in Guantanamo, they're not allowed to have any of the rights to compel witnesses, and it's just a travesty of justice what's going on in Guantanamo.
But the thing of it is, if you make a law, everybody should follow the law.
Absolutely.
That's not the case today because those in power change the law or pick which ones they want to.
And the judges let them get away with that. And that's the problem. Our judges are letting people get away with that, and they're not really enforcing the law upon government. That's why we aren't prosecuting. Nobody's been prosecuted for 9/11, and if it was incompetence.
I was wondering if you would comment on the 14th Amendment. Do you feel that it would have been better to pass the original Bill of Rights with that other amendment in there, immediately applying to the states if they didn't have to make
Yeah.
a slavery compromise?
Absolutely.
Are there any?
There's no excuse. There's no excuse for exempting the states. Now, to the credit of the state legislature, people like Madison said, look, we're safe. We are the champions of the Bill of Rights. We're not, if anybody's going to be violating, we're not going to be violating because the states, and most of them did pass later on some form of Bill of Rights, but certainly Madison didn't think that their state government was going to be violated. They trusted their state. They were the champions of liberty, and they were against federal power. But those that follow along on Virginia later on began to violate people's fundamental rights too. So, but it would have been better. But given that, when I look at the Lord's point of view of the Constitution, there's a very problematic scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants of the LDS Church, which says, anything more than this cometh of evil, speaking of the Constitution. And so Mormons think, oh, it's perfect, it's just right. Anything less power of this is evil, anything, if more restrictions of government is evil too. But that's an assumption. I don't think they understand what the Lord was really saying. The Lord knew darn well that the Constitution wasn't going to defend liberty forever, and I don't think He intended it to. See, the Lord is interested in the test. He's interested in giving the United States, let's give them 100 years of breathing space, where this will last about 100 years before they can interpret it away. In the last 100 years, they'll see the downhill destruction of their liberty, and Satan will be able to have power, and people will get tested in a more full sense. I think the Constitution was anything more or less than this gets in the way of my plans of testing the world and of allowing this to be, Satan to have sufficient power. And that's just my personal opinion. Because I've studied this document. I'll tell you, it is designed to be just enough liberty for a good moral people, and as soon as you start to lose it, it doesn't safeguard anything because it depends on trust. You had a question.
I actually have two. My first one, I thought was interesting when you talked about the abortion issue, and it was a binding contract between two people, and that they kind of gave up they chose their right to have.
Well, they're not right to disavow the responsibility for the product of their relationship. Yeah.
But what do you do in the case of rape, or when that was actually a binding contract?
Okay, I'll give you a chance on the second question after I answer this. Rape is a very interesting thing. In the first place, this is a violation of the right, of course, of the woman, right? So she had no choice. This is a one-way contract. So there is no contract on the third, is there? Except for the person that perpetrated the rape. He's fully responsible. Okay? But she's got an unintended consequence now. She's got to go through 9 months of bearing the child and nursing the child and helping or having to go through the adoption, whatever it is. She's going to have to suffer on that. So what I look at on this is the balance of rights here. Her sacrifice on rape, and this is why I do not view rape as a legitimate reason for an abortion. Though I don't say this necessarily is a matter of law. It's a balance of rights. One, she's going to suffer inconvenience, not a threat to her life. Except, this whole thing, in case of threat to the woman's life, the medical establishment uses that to excuse abortion all the time, but it's just a false thing. There's hardly ever a threat to a life. And there are many women who've said, you're going to die if you have this baby, and they have it, and they don't die. But in any case, she's going to suffer 9 months of inconvenience. To take the child's life is terminal for it. There's no more rights for the child. So I look on balance. I say it is, if both have to suffer, she can suffer the 9 months better than the child suffering the absolute termination of all his rights. So I err on the side of life, even under rape. Though in terms of God's law, He has not spoken, and certainly that's between her and God, in my opinion. But in terms of law, I would err on the side of life in that regard. Now, your second question.
This is kind of a hypothetical question, and I want your opinion on it. So I think the majority of people out there are in denial that our country is in trouble and that we are very sick. And so if the country was a patient and you were the doctor and it came to you, how much time would you give the patient? How much time do we have, in your opinion?
I believe my timetable really, and there's a piece on my website, the World Affairs Brief, called Strategic Threats of the Coming Decade or the Current Decade. And I've modified it to go over into the next decade because this threat is, I believe, what's going to take down this country as a free and sovereign individual is probably going to happen at the earliest about the middle of next decade through the end of the next decade. That's when I view as the major threat. I think it's going to be a preemptive nuclear strike against America by Russia and China. They're building for it. They practice for it. Every military exercise begins with a simulated nuclear attack on America. Now, they're not doing that just because they're our allies or because they just want to practice. They are intending to strike, both of them. China's that far out. She's not ready. Russia has got all the technology, but it doesn't have enough of the actual technology built into weapon systems yet to strike. So they're about 5 or 6 years out. China's about 8 years out.
In conjunction or separately?
In conjunction. Now, it's my feeling that they'll come in conjunction, but they're both predator states. They will both attack each other sometime during the war. And that's how the globalists intend to win, is by inducing China to attack Russia's rear sometime in the war. But remember, I think America will have a devastating nuclear attack. I think we'll be back into the dark ages there for about 6 months to a year before electricity gets fully reestablished because of all of the EMP strikes. And the nuclear strikes will not hit all cities, probably only a dozen to 15 cities, plus about 3,000 other military targets around the world. Communications, intelligence stations, we've got soldiers and troops everywhere, and most of them in any large concentration are going to get hit. This is meant to bring Americans like you to your knees and say, oh, we're just without power anymore. What do we do? And our leaders will come out of their bunkers, say the Russians deceived us. We didn't know this was happening. That's a lie, by the way. They know it's going to happen. They're inducing it to happen. And they'll say, we have no military. Our only hope now, under the name of God, country, and the Constitution, is to give our powers to the United Nations to save us. And that's how we'll get ourselves fully integrated into a new world order. And unlike World War II, where they gave back the powers, we won't get back any powers. And I'll tell you the reason. I think what they're doing, they're going to have Red China switch sides. And just like Russia became the Cold War enemy after World War II, China will become the Cold War enemy and start to threaten, and the United Nations will say, oh, we can no longer give up our weapons or our militarization because we have this big threat. And only our unified armies are big enough to tackle China. And Americans will buy it, and that's why we'll never get our liberty back. But I believe that there will be a remnant of resistors, a very, very significant, of several million people that won't go along, and they will be forced, this is my personal opinion, in this conflagration, in this nuclear, and it won't be a nuclear winter. That's an anti-war false notion. You'll actually recover fairly rapidly from the nuclear effects. They dissipate that rapidly. We won't recover from the social unrest that is caused. If you're in major metropolitan areas, you're going to be under severe stress and difficulty trying to survive the starvation and the famine. Nobody's businesses will be operating. It will be back to barter. And we're probably less than 10 years away from that scenario. Now, I wouldn't wait a full 10 years to get prepared for that, but that's going to be God's judgments on the land, and we will never be free again. It's out of that scenario that the need for a new Jerusalem arises, to have a place of safety as the tyranny of government starts to suppress the several million resistors. There'll be a test oath in my case, in my estimate. And this is where the biblical mark of the beast comes in. I don't know what the nature of the mark is, but the key point is not a number or anything else. The key is the fact that you'll be made to take an oath of allegiance to this New World Order government, or you will not be allowed to buy or sell or be a dentist or a doctor or teach in a university or do anything except work underground. And that's what's going to be the hardship. That's why I encouraged you to study law and principles, because we will have the opportunity, there will be pockets of resistance where we'll be actually in the majority in certain smaller areas, and other people will stream from other areas in the United States to join with those people, where there'll be rumors of liberty. And we have to know how to establish those. That's how I view these things. So it's not all is lost. I think there'll be great judgments, and not everyone will survive, but we need to prepare. We need to be prepared to come out from underneath the rubble and reestablish a society. Ma'am?
You said that the larger cities would be in upheaval and chaos, this type of thing. And my memory at that time kicked in, and I remember how Joseph Smith was expressing that small settlements, isolated ranches, and homes will be stormed by marauding bands. So is there going to be any place safe?
Well, that's why you need a network of people that can help defend yourself. I mean, if you're too isolated. So let me put it this way. There is no absolute safety except learning to listen to the spirit of discernment and wisdom guiding you when these things happen. Now, you have to pre-prepare. You've got to have not only food storage, you've got to have some fallout protection. I mean, the luck of the draw means that only about 20% of the people in the United States are probably going to be directly subject to killing fallout. But you don't want to be part of the 20%. And there are some major nuclear targets in the Utah area. We're storing all of the guidance systems for all the MX missiles at Hill Air Force Base that were dismantled, and the Russians don't want those MX missiles reestablished during the war. They will hit Hill Air Force Base. Dugway, Tooele, probably some others. So if the wind's blowing right, these valleys here could get inundated. Need some fallout protection, so food storage is not enough. Money, gasoline, generators. Do you get the picture? No electricity for 6 months to a year. You've got to have some ability to have a generator and store some fuel.
But wouldn't there be any fuel to keep those generators?
As I say, if you store it, you can. It's better than nothing. And there are ways. I've written several books. If you look on my website, I have some preparedness books that'll help you prepare. Sir, the prophets that saw everything that's going to happen from the beginning of the world to the end had all those visions sealed up. There's no way the Lord's going to allow you to guide yourself by prophecies alone. He's going to test every one of us to be able to listen to the spiritual promptings that guide you, and that's going to be the tough thing. That's why in my previous speech down in Orem, I cautioned the people that the secret to real survival is not just preparation, but it's learning in your own temporal affairs, your physical affairs, to listen to the voice of conscience about your weight control, about the food you eat, the junk food. You've got to get rid of that, because if you become a chronic violator of conscience, if you keep saying no to that voice, you'll be penalized someday when you really need it. You'll be not crying wolf so much. It's just becoming insensitive. You're only sensitive to things you want to hear. How to make more money and how to, get so-and-so to marry you or whatever it is. But when it comes to nutrition and discipline of children, most people say, no, I don't want to hear that. When it comes to turning off the television or not reading that or not watching that dumb movie, it's, no, I don't want to hear that. So be careful. It's those temporal things, those temporal violations that will determine whether or not you're eligible for higher spiritual light and knowledge someday. There was another question here. Ma'am.
Some things we have control over, like we know with the vaccinations, we don't have to choose to take them.
At least
not mandatory.
right now.
We've seen that happening. Yes, so that in the future could change. And like the fluoridated water, we can buy our own water,
Right.
which we're forced to do if we don't want the fluoridation. And but one of the things that upsets me are those chemtrails up there, because we have no control over that. We know what's in them. We know what's coming down on us, what's making us sick, cancer causing, and so forth. Is there anything that could be done about that?
No, there really isn't. First, the FAA will not allow any jet to get up anywhere near those chemtrailing jets to take an actual sample. There are no reliable samples that I know of. There are people who say they've got samples, etc., but when you check back in the labs, there's no labs that will certify to what's been done. Now, I'm not saying that I don't believe in chemtrails, but I'll tell you this. As an expert formal pilot in the military, I can tell you that most of what people see, that they're calling chemtrails are not chemtrails. Contrails can, in fact, imitate chemtrails on a variety of ways. There are certain things that they cannot imitate, and I've seen it. I've seen the spraying stop, start, stop, and start, and that can't happen with contrails because contrails come out of jet exhaust, and you can't just turn off and on your engine to stop that condensation. Now, the biggest proof of chemtrails, though, is the photographs, and there's one on Carnahan.com, of photographs of a 4-engine airplane with 8 contrails coming out of it. Now, that is proof that someone's spraying, is it not? Because contrails are what? Condensation trails coming out of jet engines. So the maximum contrails you can have of a 4-engine jet is 4. When you have 8 coming out of it, you're spraying. Now, that's proof. Okay, when people just see contrails that stay and spread out, that's not necessarily a chemtrail. You have to be an expert. I can't even tell the difference without going up and analyzing that. But some things you can't. Back and forth, a pattern, that's chemtrailing because airliners don't do that. And you've seen that occasionally. Okay, but it's only very occasional. Well, as I say, and it comes in periods and cycles. I personally believe that we don't know what they're trying yet. It could be weather modification. It could be radar blocking. It could be practicing for this and that. It is a secret military program. They are military jets. They are classified. There are FAA databases on all aircraft in the sky, and you have this thing that got no numbers on it, and this one no numbers. You call them up, and the FAA says that's classified. That's oftentimes a chemtrailer because, when I saw it over Utah County, these 2 jets coming by, and they were at the same altitude, and one was spraying, and the other was, something was wrong with the spraying. It was off and on and off and on, just right there, same altitude. So that can't be a contrail. So that to me was proof, and I'm living proof that I've seen one. But you have to be careful about claiming too much because it does take a great deal of expertise just because you see several jets fly over. If they're not coming back over the same area...
I've seen them do that, and I've seen the sky, blue sky change to the white haze.
Yeah, but that isn't proof yet. That isn't proof because contrails can do that too under certain atmospheric conditions. You have to see them covering an actual pattern or off and on spraying and various other things. Question?
Yeah, I don't mean to switch gears on you or anything, but I've read your website and how you're talking about how the fall of Russia might have been possibly a ruse as to the creation of the new world.
The fall of communism, right? Right.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and I'm not sure if it was yours or Lyndon LaRouche's site that was suggesting that what they were trying to do was bring the United States down and bring Russia up in certain other areas so that we could kind of synchronize to become the...
Okay, that's 2 different things. That's the Rowan Gaither quote, which I don't believe in. I believe that was disinformation, where he told Chairman Dodd of the House Un-American Activities Committee that the real purpose of the foundations was to create a successful merger between Russia and the United States, and that's disinformation. Russia is a predator. That led the conservatives to believe that the globalists were actually controlling Russia and that we won't have a nuclear attack because the Russians work for the globalists, and it isn't true. The Russians are predators. They are intending to strike, and the globalists are playing this game of feeding them and helping them under the table. And the Russians, in fact, can't figure this out. They think the Americans are stupid. They don't realize that the ease at which the Russians have been able to infiltrate the FBI is because we have facilitated that. Alger Hiss was not, in my opinion, a communist. Alger Hiss was a globalist who had gone into the communists and was leading them and bringing in their agents into government because that's what the globalists want to do, is to undermine our own country and do things like that. And we still do that. We have undermined China, Laos, Vietnam, Iran, many different countries, not because they were communists in our government, but they were globalists weakening those countries so that they come in and save them later on with globalism. It's kind of a Hegelian dialectic where you create conflict to be able to give them a solution that they wouldn't otherwise respect. But the fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception. The communists were, in fact, the ones that gave themselves all the wealth of the Soviet Union and are now called the oligarchs. Those were the actual communist leaders who were running Russia underground when Brezhnev and Andropov and Gorbachev, those were just underlings. They weren't the real leaders of Russia. The real leaders were the Boris Berezovskys and the other leaders who are now called the oligarchs, who claim to be the enemies of Putin. Putin, in fact, met with Berezovsky 5 times in his villa in Spain the year he ascended to the presidency. Doesn't sound like an enemy to me.
Is there a difference between a totalitarian effort and design and the globalists? I mean,
yes, there is. There is a difference. And it's the difference between communism and Fabian socialism. Communism wants to totally obliterate the free market, and everything is controlled, absolute cradle-to-grave controlled socialism. And that's what tyranny does. But it doesn't work. The smarter satanic conspiracy is that we manage the free market. We keep it alive by giving him just enough rights, just enough lack of regulation, enough free market stuff to milk it so that we continue to have a cow to milk. You don't kill the cow. You don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So the globalists have this smarter third way of keeping you thinking you're free and milking you of your money and your assets in order to finance the payola system, which is buying votes through giving benefits. And they have to keep squashing benefits to make sure they don't overpower the productive class. And just like Sweden and Norway have had to cut their level of benefits in order to keep the country from going bankrupt. But they have no intention of actually letting their people free. They have learned to milk the free market, the partially free market, to feed socialism, because it's the ability to buy benefits that keeps those people in power. Sir?
Go back to some comments you were making a minute ago. You were alluding, I assume, to prophecies about in the last days saints and others congregating here in the Rocky Mountains, that here and nowhere else really with all the disarray in the United States will be a respect for the rule of law. And you touched upon earlier, the potential need in the future to remake law or understand law such that we can craft it, with stronger reinforcements. In your mind, if and when that occurs, do you see it as we're enforcing the Constitution but with some specific additional amendments to make it better? Will there be a different law based upon the principles contained in the Constitution? How do you see that kind of coming about?
Well, the system that we have today is the Constitution just there in the background. We have layered the Constitution with 50 layers of law, specific law, and case law and interpretation. Hardly anyone goes back to the actual Constitution except when they need it to do a few things like this. So I think it's going to be the same thing, just because most conservatives would not go for a new Constitution. In fact, the danger of a new Constitution is you lose the convention. The socialists become the majority and they vote a different Constitution and you just lose it. That's why I've never been in favor of a constitutional convention, because we don't have the numbers to control it. And we'd get a much worse constitution. So what you have to do is essentially, and I'm not sure it will happen. I'm saying there may be the possibility, but certainly if you stay among the mainstream, and if the mainstream people even surrounding in these valleys here stay alive, it's going to be a mainstream government system. It's not going to be much different than what it is. There'll be order there, but there won't be much different in law. It's only if it's very, very severe and you have a chance to start, and I think it's going to have to start even in smaller communities outside these major valleys, where they start to knit together and have a truly free market, covenant-type society. And they start to knit together faster, so they attract more people to their growing communities than these destroyed cities who are in essence still in social unrest. That's what I'm hoping is a possibility. If we never get the chance, and it could be that there'll be turmoil, and that's the reason you have to flee to the New Jerusalem, because there never is peace here, really. In fact, the Lord seems to indicate that the more righteous are driven out among them, and the people, and the majority doesn't even know that the New Jerusalem is being built. So it doesn't pretend that there's going to be a success aftermath. I'm suggesting that we need to know how to do law correctly, because even in the millennium, you're going to have a chance to do it over again. Because people think the Lord is going to come in the second coming and say, all right, here's how you do it from A to Z. He's never done that. He has never done that. He said, established a few basic principles, and this was right, this was wrong. He corrects people. These were the secret acts of men. Don't let these secret combinations. Now go to it again and see if you can do it right. And we want to be in a position where we establish true liberty in the millennium without having these establishment lawyers try to mimic what we've got here in their own favor.
Second question. Glenn Beck has offered for Ron Paul to come in for an hour, and he's finally accepted, and that happens on Tuesday. I was wondering if you had any comments on.
Well, I've received several since I made some very critical comments of Glenn Beck. Other people have written to me and said Glenn Beck has really gotten enthused about defending the Constitution. And he has. On his show, he's touted the Constitution. He's still got a lot. He's still a pretty strong wild card in my estimation. He's not a careful speaker. He makes outlandish comments. He shoots from the hip. I'm never going to trust a person who's too much like Rush Limbaugh. I will respect the fact that he has good conservative basic values and he's trying to do the right thing. But if he really bucked the establishment, he'd be out of a job. I know that. And so if he's still got a job, he hasn't really taken a position. And that position will be based on one thing. He needs to apologize to Ron Paul for calling his supporters, you and I, potential domestic terrorists. He needs to apologize on the air for that.
Was that direct against 911?
Sure. Well, but no, in general he said that. But he is also virulently anti-conspiratorial. And conspiracy is the essence of truth. Conspiracy has always existed in this world. Anyone who believes in traditional history that it has never occurred with conspiracy is just fooling themselves. Every single major event in history has been conspired by evil men to occur. And very rarely does it follow the pattern that our traditional history books say it does. It isn't that those things, the Archduke Ferdinand was killed, and it did precipitate World War II, but it's who connived to kill him and what they achieved by that and who they wanted to provoke. They were, you see, there's much more under the surface. So I will never become a fan of Glenn Beck until he takes the hard road of defending conspiracy, and then he'll be out of a job, and then I'll be in favor of Glenn Beck.
What is your take on Iran and the latest things that happened the last week with the NIE, and then our value of the dollar around?
Yeah, I dedicated a whole World Affairs brief to that NIE. The short version of that is they engineered the reversal of that intelligence to give them an excuse not to attack Iran. But they're still planning on attacking, just a postponement. But they couldn't afford to do it for two reasons, in my opinion. One, the real danger that the public opinion, the public support of an attack on Iran is just non-existent. And should they do that without sufficient phony justification, without another 9/11 to blame it on Iran, the public backlash could have been significantly strong that it might double Ron Paul's numbers. He's the only anti-war person. He's the only one that would have benefited from an attack on Iran. Everyone else would have looked very stupid trying to wave the flag and appear super patriotic. Secondarily, this economy is so weak, so much on the brink, that it will not take another $1 trillion hit in deficit spending for an attack right now. They have to stabilize that before I think they can pull this attack. And that's why I think they engineered this whole thing about there's hawks and doves within the intelligence. They purged all the good guys out of the intelligence when Porter Goss was put in charge to do the purge. This whole thing about people reviling against the president and Cheney just isn't true. And that's why they engineered, after the NIE came out, they engineered this backlash on the press where every talking head was talking about, oh, this NIE is a bunch of baloney, Iran is a threat, and sure enough, it worked. A week after the NIE came out, they polled the American public, USA Today, and 82% thought Iran was still a threat. And now they never have to prove that Iran has nuclear weapons. It's already assumed now because they stopped. It's like saying, when did you stop beating your wife? You have your neighbor said that you stopped 3 years ago. So what does it do? It proves that you beat. If you stopped, you had to have been beating her. Well, if you stopped a nuclear weapon, you had. Now you don't have to prove that they had weapons. We only proved that they stopped it. See how slick that is? This was just devious from A to Z, what they did. And so I think it's just a postponement, frankly. You have a question?
To follow up with the economy, what is your views on the formation of the North American Union and tied with the economy and the dollar?
I don't believe that they're going to go switching to an AMRO. It wouldn't do any good at a time that they have to actually trade value for value. In other words, if you're inflating the dollar to oblivion and you've got to trade all those dollars for AMROs, what have you done? You haven't accomplished anything. So I don't see this. The old proof on the internet that an AMRO had been minted was actually minted by a novelty company. Someone from the mint sent it to this minister who was proclaiming all this. They just played him for a fool. It was a novelty coin. The AMROs have not been printed. It is not a serious threat at this time. The North American Union is, however, and they are trying to do it by stealth, and they're trying to get this entire thing built, and then they'll just say it's a done deal, because they know the American people will never go for it if you put it up front before the people. That's why there is a conspiracy to keep it under the table. Very, very, and that's real proof of conspiracy, where you collude between people and lie about it to the public. But it's very real.
Still on schedule for not 2 years away?
Oh, no. I think it's going to take a major crisis before they pull that off. It may happen during war, for all I know, but they're definitely heading for it. And one of the things about predicting conspiracies is it's very difficult to know when they're going to do things, because these are not like predicting a fall when you have an unregulated economy. This economy should collapse, and would collapse if they didn't keep printing money and injecting it. The liquidity they pulled off that I covered in this week's brief. And you can, by the way, if you want a sample of that brief, you can go to worldaffairsbrief.com, send me an email to editor@worldaffairsbrief, and get the current World Affairs Brief. And I talk about the economy this month and what they're attempting to do in the Fed's new auction, where in reality, they're going to allow banks to trade in their subprime mortgages for new loans to get them out of the market. And it's the Fed that's going to absorb those subprime loans, which means we, the taxpayer. It's real slick. Sir? Yeah.
And I know that it's been your opinion that they don't want to inconvenience the majority of the people until, they're right there. How would they have to induce China and Russia to step up their schedule a little faster? How are we going to keep it rolling?
Well, how they kept it going this long. Look at the bubble they engendered. We were in danger of collapse in the 80s. Now, that was too young for you, but I mean, when I was in the 80s, that's when the hard money movement started. You had you had hard money conferences with Howard Ruff and all of those people. I don't know how many of you old timers remember those. They were thinking of the collapse of the dollar and everything clear back and then, because they were inflating. And I was saying at that time, no, you can't even imagine how much more inflation they can do, because you got this whole world absorbing dollars. They can export our inflation. Now they're running out of that. You see, the point is they have used up. And so your question is very valid. They've tried all their tricks now, and they're left only with inflation. And they're playing lots of games, but they are holding the world hostage to the billions of dollars that they already hold. They can't unload them. If you start to unload dollars in big blocks, the price is going to fall, that you'll lose all the value. And so these people, China and the European, they're stuck holding this stuff. And they're slowly starting to take less dollars, but they can't even afford to not buy U.S. Treasury, because they milk the U.S. economy. China needs the U.S. economy to be strong. So they've all got a vested interest in continuing to inflate the dollar. So it's going to go higher. It's just going to continue to inflate. We're going to see not hyperinflation, but steady 10% inflation per year probably from now until then. I think we could have a recession. They may not be able to pull this off, but believe me, they'll come out of the recession through inflation again. So that's why I say you have to get into the inflationary game. You have to have something rising. Otherwise, you'll never keep pace with it. In the back?
So is there a benefit to paying off your home?
Yes, there is. And the reason is because today's interest rates, what you can get in safe investments and even T-bills, is still less than the interest that you're paying on your home. So your biggest value is to get rid of that debt in the home in terms of... But you have to be very careful of getting into a low principal. If you pay off 80% of your home, you're the first one they're going to want to foreclose on. So you want to make sure that when you get close or something, go out and try to borrow something else to pay off that so that you're not,
So, well, with inflation coming at such a rapid rate, I'm looking at maybe 5 years down the road, maybe you could pay it off with cheaper dollars or whatever. I don't know.
Yes, I don't know. I've always felt very strongly that I need to have a debt-free home because I know that when this war comes, that you don't want to be at risk of losing your home. There's not any county government that's going to be able to foreclose on anybody because of property taxes.
And what's the danger in terms of, you said it a while ago, if you don't owe very much on your home, that's going to be one of the first ones to go.
Right, because they get the maximum value of you defaulting on the loan that they only owe $20,000 on. They'd love to have your home because they get the full block of value, whereas the person who owns 90% of their mortgage still, they don't gain anything but a white elephant that they can't sell.
So they want it particularly.
They don't want those particularly. They want the ones with the low down payment. So when you pay it off, get it paid off quickly when it gets down there low.
Would you be safer owing a lot more on a big
But then you run the risk, of course, not being able to pay and losing it. So, listen, debt-free is really the only way that you're really going to survive well. So, get debt-free when you can.
In 3 Nephi, chapter 16, that the Lord, God warns us that when the Gentiles reject the fullness of the gospel, will be trodden down by the house of Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that the church members have rejected the fullness of the gospel.
That the members of the church have?
Yeah. The fullness of the gospel has been rejected because we're not being taught the fullness of the gospel.
Well, there's a lot of pablum being taught, I'll admit, but
we've rejected the teaching of the prophets with the warnings of the prophets about the Constitution and everything. We've not even talked about that anymore.
Well, it's pretty hard to make the case, though, that, members of the church are still very sincere. I think they're very selective in what they want to listen to. But this is really referring to the Gentiles in America, not the church. When the Gentiles in America reject, and that means generally when you see the missionaries being driven out because of persecution and other things, you'll see that the nation's really ripe for iniquity. But we're ripe for iniquity as it is. It can get a lot worse, though, still. You look at the progress that homosexuality is making in terms of legal inroads and acceptance inroads into the media. You hardly see any sitcom now on television or in the movies that doesn't promote the homosexual agenda. That's one of the biggest things that the Lord will use as a judgment, in my estimation, for America. But although I think that there is some weakness in the church, in the people seeking for mainstream acceptance and being comfortable in the world and trying to have both the world and the church, it's not that weakness that is going to cause America necessarily to lose its liberty. It's going to cause some real trials and tribulation upon members because of that worldliness. But that's as far as I would go.
Ron Paul has an excellent article that I recommend everyone read titled "The End of Dollar Hegemony." Very long, and he talks extensively about the history of the dollar, the fiat dollar, and how since there's no specie, no gold or silver backing the dollar, it's only our military might that is backing the dollar. And he talked specifically about Iraq and how before we went into Iraq, Saddam was threatening to move off of the dollar for oil, and how we subsequently went into Iraq under false pretenses, of course, but that one of the possible reasons was to enforce the receiving of our dollars, exporting the inflation you just talked about. I don't know if you saw, I assume you did, several weeks ago, OPEC had about half an hour of their meeting that was broadcast to the world on accident, where they were discussing just that, moving off the dollar standard. Iran has done it, Kuwait has done it. There have been several countries have now moved completely off of the dollar. Do you see that as a strong reason for us to attack Iran or some other country, that will still be used?
I don't really, because none of the euro bourses, such as Iran's, has ever come about. Iraq's was already a failure, and the reason is because most of the purchasers of the dollars are buying. I mean, if you want to sell cars to America, you take dollars. And that's what the car manufacturers in Japan and Germany are having a problem now, is that they can't raise their prices in America, and yet Americans can't afford more than what they have, and so they have to take less money for it. Same thing with oil. If you're going to sell to America, you're going to have to sell it in dollars. And interestingly enough, Europeans have a lot of dollars in governments, and do they want to give the euros away? No, they want to give the dollars away. So they're resisting the change. They want the dollars to have so that they can unload their dollars in the Arabs. And the Arabs, you see, are getting stuck with all these dollars, and that's why they're buying up half of Citicorp and other types of investments. They're trying to buy up the United States as something of value, because they know sitting on those dollars they're going to keep losing. So it's not that simple. I really frankly believe in the globalist reason for antagonizing the world as the main reason for, as well as tying up oil supplies, because in this next Third World War, they want to deny those oil supplies to Russia and China as much as possible. So those are some of the long-term reasons. But just to support the dollar, I really have my doubts that that's anywhere near the top of the list. It may be on the list, but not certainly the top.
Do you think that's a factor then in oil prices rising?
Absolutely. You know, when the Fed made the announcement last week about this new auction where they were going to start to trade collateralized debt for new loans, that was without saying it, we're going to let you unload your subprime loans to the Fed and to every other central bank had agreed. Oil went up $5 because of the inflation. There was nothing in the oil market that changed. No more. In fact, the threat to Iran was less, and oil went up because of the dollar's value going down. So oil price is more reflecting the falling dollar than it is unrest in the world now.
Compulsory schooling seems to me to be much worse than what the established religion was in England in the beginning. In recent, I don't know how long, we've been able to establish homeschooling and different things. Are we going to be able to continue that, or are they going to come back and attack that?
I personally think that it's gone too far to put that genie back in the bottle. I think at best they're going to try to re-regulate or require testing or other types of things, and if you fail the test, then we take your kids back in the school. They tried to do that in Oregon once, and I asked the superintendent, so do I assume then that if my kids fail the test in your school, I get them back? You see? He said, no. Well, I said, so the issue isn't competency. The issue is control, isn't it? He wouldn't answer. But that's a good question. If they fail in your school, do I get them back?
A question on rights. Can you comment, as far as giving identification, right, showing papers, do we have a right that way or not? And what to not have to?
There is no.
To not have to show papers or show identification. What?
Well, you have a unique identity, and this is something that is an appropriate venue to discuss as part of the citizenship covenant that you make. It's how much privacy do you give up for the ability to certify and keep identity theft and other things, and how much do you keep back and you keep government away? It's not an absolute right, because we actually, in order to have contract, we have to have certified. To have a legitimate legal system where we have to be able to certify identity, signature, and you can go to fingerprints or DNA or other types of things for your own protection. But this is something that has to be worked out with a strategy of we've got to make sure that it is not easy for government to begin to surveil and curtail liberty, and one must always be vigilant about denying government the power, making it difficult for them to enforce law to a certain extent in order to provide ease of ways of getting out of bad law. Now, it's much less of a problem if you enact a constitution supplement like I've written for the Constitution, because you just prohibit government from doing so many things that it becomes very difficult. You're more safe then to use open identity and don't have to be so much afraid of that if you properly restrict government. And you have, I mean, one of the most important things that I've got in my system is a new type of way of changing the Supreme Court. In today's, the justices are political appointees, and that makes them suspect to the process. That's why there's this tug-of-war in the Senate. Every time you're going to put in a new Supreme Court justice, everybody wants somebody that they can control in there. And, of course, you always get somebody the globalists control, even when they're conservative, like Thomas, because they got a file that thick on his sexual or moral indiscretions. And so they can control him, even though he's a conservative. I mean, there are ways to control him. They control Hatch because they've got things that they can, and Bennett ran a CIA front company, for many, many years. And the Watergate burglars worked for Senator Bennett when he was a civilian running this company. So there's a lot of things that we can... But there isn't anything inherently wrong with having to prove your identity and having Social Security numbers or other things. It's what they do with it later on that we need to protect against. There's nothing wrong really with... It's like I say with the mark of the beast. It's the oath that they require.
So when police officers ask for ID, are there times when that's appropriate for them to do and times when it's inappropriate? Or
Well, you have to show your identification. That happened down in Nevada when that guy got in confrontation with his daughter. He lost that court case.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. I think it's only something that when identification is an issue. For example, if you are accused of a crime, says you are now accused and you're going to be arrested, you have to give your identification. And you want to give your identification because habeas corpus depends on you identifying yourself. But if you're not accused of a crime, you don't have to give him your name or anything. Do you have you accused me of a crime? Am I going to be arrested? Then you don't. So he was actually right. He was not guilty of a crime. The courts, of course, weren't going to let him do that. But because the courts ruled against him didn't mean that he was. So I will agree with you that there are certain areas, and it has to do with why do you need my identity, do you see?
so in that kind of a case, how do you keep from becoming accused of resisting arrest and being tasered?
Better show him your ID.
Well, yeah, so therefore I have no real right because...
Well, you have the right of the way the courts rule now, and so to keep yourself...
But you have to keep police. You have to keep police on a very short leash because to be police officers legitimately, and you're going to have some ability to exercise force. I mean, I don't make a very good police officer. I'm 140 pounds. It would be very hard for me, even with advanced skills that I got in the Marine Corps, to go up against a 250-pounder. It's just the laws of physics. And but so the police officers tend to have a little bit of macho mentality, and you've got to bind down macho mentality with the threat of use of false arrest or false authority. It's got to be very, very strictly enforced. And that's what this video cam on this highway patrolman in Utah got all the way around the nation because he was clearly out of line. He was clearly out of line. And nothing happened to him, of course. His yes-man boss got up there to protect him. But I thought it was a disgrace to Utah to see that video on television of that. He should have been clearly... in fact, the guy had a clear court case. It's right on the video. He ought to take him to court on it because I think he could get a jury to convict that police officer.
Yes, undoubtedly time is short, and when we walk out of this room, the people in the hallway and the people in the parking lot are just going to say, there's more of those Ron Paul kooks or those 911 truthers or something like that. Now, someone's going to go about it their way and do what we've talked about in this room. I'm going to go about it another way. Is there a way that we as a group can have a united focus in furthering some of these principles?
That's the toughest thing about our movement. It only takes one thing to unite liberals, and it only takes one thing to divide conservatives.
Or do we just sit back and wait for the spirit? Is there you have any parting words of...
Okay, that's a good way to end on. Let me just see what we can come up with here. First of all, Our first and foremost obligation is to ourselves and our family to do what's right and get prepared. You have been warned. Now, I may be right, I may not be right about timing, but I'll tell you, I am not wrong about this country getting attacked someday. As sure am I living here, sure as I am standing here, we're going to have a major attack against this United States. And if you think food storage is enough, you're not going to be prepared. It's a much broader range of things. It doesn't take a lot of money, but it does take some learning skills. You've got to be able to develop the skills. If you're a one-skill person, you're not going to do well when the society breaks down. You've got to be able to fix everything. You've got to be able to trade. You've got to be healthy. You've got to stockpile things that you need, and that means get off of your medicines. They're not going to be available. Learn natural health. Learn to live by conscience. Learn discipline. Toughen your grandchildren. Toughen your kids. You're going to need to be tough. So your responsibilities are to your family. And the first and foremost thing is learn to listen to conscience, because you won't be able to read enough books to be prepared by rote memorization. You're going to have to play it on the fly. You're going to have, secondly, a network of support. There isn't much that we can do other than support Ron Paul. I think if we did one thing, we will build this movement more in the next 6 months by supporting Ron Paul than any other thing that we can do. You know, a lot of the people, I've seen you at meetings before, I've talked to these groups for many, many years. This is the only time where we had significant increase of numbers. So I support, even though I usually don't support political causes because I believe it's a lost cause, I support Ron Paul financially because I believe this will do more to build the movement. We are bringing in independents, principled liberals, and what I mean by principled Democrats or liberals are people who just have a soft part in their heart, and that's why they bought into socialism. It isn't because they're communists or that they want to take away liberty. They just have a soft spot. They don't see the hidden victims of socialism. They're educatable, and Ron Paul is educating them. He's turning them into independents and then turning independents into libertarians. So this is a great time to build a movement, and we need to then consolidate that when we see how many people are there, and we need to have something residual to which they can rally around. Now, in terms of your helping other people, I've said this before in other venues, but don't try to convince people who are resistant. Only try to convince people who sense that something's wrong. If they haven't got enough inspiration in their brain to sense that something's wrong, don't waste your breath. You're just going to make enemies that are going to target you someday and say, he's one of those guys, and he's one of those guys. Now, I'm out there in the front. I'm never going to be able to hide. I'm always going to be known, so let me do the front work for you. Go for people who are honest and sincere in their heart and who sense that something's wrong, and you can tell.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, and there's more people out there. And Ron Paul's a good way to introduce them and to test them as to their ability, because he's a kindly gentleman. He's not someone who they have been able to label. Even though he believes in conspiracy, he won't say so publicly. And I agree with that strategy. If you're going to run for political office, and people have asked me to run political office, and I'm on record for too much. They could destroy me in an instant by just playing one of these tape recordings. So you see, I'm never going to be running for political office, but Ron Paul has done it wisely and cautiously and still comes across what? As a politician? Not in your life. Comes across as a statesman. And that's who he's winning hearts and minds of people. So I don't have a lot of hope, but I do know this, that we will forever more rely on each other, the people who were in the trenches when it was not popular, before the New World Order became a tyranny, when it will be easy for the majority on the outside to finally see it. You will have the comfort of knowing you sensed it by the Spirit before they even had a clue. And there will be rewards in heaven someday for those who were known as those who saw before the rest of the world. And many of those good people repent of their ignorance when the secret acts of men are revealed at the second coming. And all of these mild-mannered establishment people are shocked because the people they most admired and trusted turned out to be Gadians. They will repent but they will be forever labeled in the next life as they couldn't see until they were told. No, there's no comfort. But you will have the comfort of knowing that you saw. And that's wonderful. Well, listen, I'm going to have to answer any other further questions after the end. We have to close now. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
If I may step into this century for just a moment and reinforcing what the young gentleman here says, and I can say that young since I'm over 300 years old almost. Point being, number one, that there is a problem with the conservative movement. I've noticed, you do not realize, but I worked for Bo Greitz very closely long ago. And I discovered then the weakness of the conservative movement. There are three things that happen continuously. One is that we paint ourselves onto a bullseye. Don't paint yourself onto a bullseye. The second thing we do is we're continually divisive. We follow into many different directions because conservatives by nature are like chickens. Try to herd them someday, right? And the third thing is don't make yourself look like a fool. We have to retain some level of respectability. Would you agree with me on that? Okay. Now, the other thing I would say in the closing, and by the way, the young lady who was going to provide a closing prayer, she's still here. Perhaps not. Then we'll have to call on another. But the other thing I would say is this, something that President Benson said in a slightly paraphrased way, was that there are many people who are afraid to be involved in this battle for freedom because it is not a popular fight. He says they make a critical mistake, and that is that your eternal destiny will not be determined by where the Gallup polls say, but rather by where you stand, and you will enjoy freedom in the next life only to the extent to which you stand for freedom in this life. Consider that. The arbiter of victory will come here, within your heart, within your knowledge, your brains, and then your reliance upon providence, which our founders always relied upon most definitely.